The preface of The Manual of Egyptian Archaeology and Guide to the Study of Antiquities in Egypt by Gaston Maspero. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Timothy Ferguson. Manual of Egyptian Archaeology and Guide to the Study of Antiquities in Egypt by Gaston Maspero. Translated by Amelia B. Edwards. Preface to the fourth and revised edition. Notwithstanding the fact that Egyptology is now recognized as a science, an exact and communicable knowledge of whose existence and scope it behooves all modern culture to take cognizance, this work of Monsieur Maspero still remains the Handbook of Egyptian Archaeology. But Egyptology is as yet in its infancy. Whatever their age, Egyptologists will long die young. Every year, almost every month, fresh material for the study is found. Fresh light is thrown upon it by the progress of excavation, exploration, and research. Hence it follows that in the course of a few years the standard textbooks require considerable addition and modification if they are to be of the greatest value to students, who must always start from the foremost vantage ground. The increasing demand for the Egyptian archaeology by English and American tourists, as well as students, decided the English publishers to issue a new edition in as light and portable a form as possible. This edition is carefully corrected, and contains the enlarged letterpress and many fresh illustrations necessary for incorporating within the book adequate accounts of the main archaeological results of recent Egyptian excavations. Monsieur Maspero has himself revised the work, indicated all the numerous additions, and qualified the expression of any views which he has seen reason to modify in the course of his researches during the past 8 years. By the headings of the pages, the descriptive titles of the illustrations, and a minute revision of the index, much has been done to facilitate the use of the volume as a book of reference. In that capacity it will be needed by the student long after he first makes acquaintance with its instructive and abundant illustrations, and its luminous condensation of the archaeological facts and conclusions which have been elucidated by Egyptology through the devotion of many an arduous lifetime during the present century, and not least by the unremitting labours of Monsieur Maspero. April 1895. Preface to the first edition. To put this book into English, and thus to hand it on to thousands who might not otherwise have enjoyed it, has been to me a very congenial and interesting task. It would be difficult, I imagine, to point to any work of its scope and character which is better calculated to give lasting delight to all classes of readers. For the skilled archaeologist, its pages contain not only new facts, but new views and new interpretations, while to those who know little, or perhaps nothing, of the subjects under discussion, it will open a fresh and fascinating field of study. It is not enough to say that a handbook of Egyptian archaeology was much needed, and that Professor Maspero has given us exactly what we required. He has done much more than this. He has given us a picturesque, vivacious, and highly original volume, as delightful as if it were not learned, and as instructive as if it were dull. As regards the practical side of archaeology, it ought to be unnecessary to point out that its usefulness is strictly parallel with the usefulness of public museums. To collect and exhibit objects of ancient art and industry is worse than idle, if we do not also endeavour to disseminate some knowledge of the history of those arts and industries, and of the processes employed by the artists and craftsmen of the past. Archaeology, no less than love, adds a precious seeing to the eye, and without that gain of mental sight, the treasures of our public collections are regarded by the general visitor as mere curiosities, flat and stale for the most part, and wholly unprofitable. I am much indebted to Mr. W. M. Flinders Petrie, author of The Pyramids and Temples of Giza, for kindly translating the section on Pyramids, which is entirely from his pen. I have also to thank him for many valuable notes on subjects dealt with in the first 3 chapters. To avoid confusion, I have numbered these notes and placed them at the end of the volume. Reader's note: footnotes are not included in this audio recording. Reader's note ends. My acknowledgments are likewise due to Professor Maspero for the care with which he has read the proof sheets of this version of his work. In departing from his system of orthography and that of Mr. Petrie, I have been solely guided by the necessities of English readers. I foresee that Egyptian archaeology will henceforth be the inseparable companion of all English-speaking travellers who visit the valley of the Nile. Hence I have for the most part adopted the spelling of Egyptian proper names as given by the author of Murray's Handbook for Egypt. Touching my own share in the present volume, I will only say that I have tried to present Professor Maspero's inimitable French in the form of readable English, rather than in a strictly word-for-word translation, and that, with the hope of still further extending the usefulness of the book, I have added some footnote references. Footnotes are not included in this audio recording. Amelia B. Edwards. Westbury-on-Trim, August 1887. End of preface. Recording by Timothy Ferguson, Gold Coast, Australia. Chapter 1, Section 1 of Manual of Egyptian Archaeology and Guide to the Study of Antiquities in Egypt by Gaston Maspero, translated by Amelia B. Edwards. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Timothy Ferguson. Chapter 1, Architecture, Civil and Military. Section 1, Houses. Archaeologists, when visiting Egypt, have so concentrated their attention upon temples and tombs that not one has devoted himself to a careful examination of the existing remains of private dwellings and military buildings. Few countries, nevertheless, have preserved so many relics of their ancient civil architecture. Setting aside towns of Roman or Byzantine date, such as are found almost intact at Koptos, at Komombo, and at Elagandia, one half at least of ancient Thebes still exists on the east and south of Karnak. The site of Memphis is covered with mounds, some of which are from 50 to 60 feet in height, each containing a core of houses in good preservation. At Kahun, the ruins and remains of a whole provincial 12th dynasty town have been laid bare. At Tel el Maskuta, the granaries of Pithom are yet standing. At San, Tanis, and Tel Basta, Bubastis, the Ptolemaic and Satic cities contain quarters of which plans might be made, and in many localities which escape the traveller's notice, there may be seen ruins of private dwellings which date back to the age of the Ramessides, or to a still earlier period. As regards these fortresses, there are two in the town of Abydos alone, one of which is at least contemporary with the 6th dynasty, while the ramparts of El Kab, of Korm el Amha, of El Hibeh, and of Dacca, as well as part of the fortifications of Thebes, are still standing, and await the architect who shall deign to make them an object of serious study. 1. Private dwellings. The soil of Egypt, periodically washed by the inundation, is a black, compact, homogeneous clay, which becomes of stony hardness when dry. From immemorial time the Fellahin have used it for the construction of their houses. The hut of the poorest peasant is a mere rudely shaped mass of this clay. A rectangular space, some 8 or 10 feet in width, by perhaps 16 or 18 feet in length, is enclosed in a wickerwork of palm branches, coated on both sides with a layer of mud. As this coating cracks in the drying, the fissures are filled in, and more coats of mud are daubed on until the walls attain a thickness of from 4 inches to a foot. Finally, the whole is roofed over with palm branches and straw, the top being covered in with a thin layer of beaten earth. The height varies. In most huts the ceiling is so low that to rise suddenly is dangerous both to one's head and to the structure, while in others the roof is 6 or 7 feet from the floor. Windows, of course, there are none. Sometimes a hole is left in the middle of the roof to let the smoke out, but this is a refinement undreamt of by many. At the first glance it is not always easy to distinguish between these huts of wattle and daub and those built with crude bricks. The ordinary Egyptian brick is a mere oblong block of mud mixed with chopped straw and a little sand, and dried in the sun. At a spot where they are about to build, one man is told off to break up the ground, others carry the clods and pile them in a heap, while others again mix them with water, knead the clay with their feet, and reduce it to a homogeneous paste. This paste, when sufficiently worked, is pressed by the head workman in moulds made of hard wood, while an assistant carries away the bricks as fast as they are shaped, and lays them out in rows a little distance apart to dry in the sun. A careful brickmaker will leave them thus for half a day, or even a whole day, after which the bricks are piled in stacks in such wise that the air can circulate freely among them, and so they remain for a week or two before they are used. More frequently, however, they are exposed for only a few hours to the heat of the sun, and the building is begun while they are yet damp. The mud, however, is so tenacious that, notwithstanding this carelessness, they are not readily put out of shape. The outer faces of the bricks become disintegrated by the action of the weather, but those in the inner part of the wall remain intact, and are still separable. A good modern workman will easily mould 1,000 bricks a day, and after a week's practice he may turn out 1,200, 1,500, or even 1,800. The ancient workmen, whose appliances in no wise differed from those of the present day, produced equally satisfactory results. The dimensions they generally adopted were 8.7 by 4.3 by 5.5 inches for ordinary bricks, or 15.0 by 7.1 by 5.5 for a larger size, though both larger and smaller are often met with in the ruins. Bricks issued from the royal workshops were sometimes stamped with the cartouches of the reigning monarch, while those made in private factories bore on the side a trademark in red ochre, a squeeze of the moulder's fingers, or the stamp of the maker. By far the greatest number have, however, no distinctive mark. Burnt bricks were not often used before the Roman period, nor tiles, either flat or curved. Glazed bricks appear to have been in fashion in the Delta. The finest specimen that I have seen, namely one in the Gizeh Museum, is inscribed in black ink with the cartouches of Rameses III. The glaze of this brick is green, but other fragments are coloured blue, red, yellow, or white. The nature of the soil does not allow of deep foundations. It consists of a thin bed of made earth, which, except in large towns, never reaches any degree of thickness. Below this comes a very dense humus, permeated by slender veins of sand, and below this again, at the level of infiltration, comes a bed of mud, more or less soft according to the season. The native builders of the present day are content to remove only the made earth, and lay their foundations on the primeval soil, or, if that lies too deep, they stop at a yard or so below the surface. The old Egyptians did likewise, and I have never seen any ancient house of which the foundations were more than 4 feet deep. Even this is exceptional, the depth in most cases not being more than 2 feet. They very often did not trouble themselves to cut trenches at all. They merely levelled the space intended to be covered, and, having probably watered it to settle the soil, they at once laid the bricks upon the surface. When the house was finished, the scraps of mortar, the broken bricks, and the accumulated refuse of the work made a bed of 8 inches or a foot in depth, and the base of the wall, thus buried, served instead of a foundation. When the new house rose on the ruins of an older one, decayed by time or ruined by accident, the builders did not even take the trouble to raise the old walls to the ground. Levelling the surface of the ruins, they built upon them at a level a few feet higher than before. Thus each town stands upon one or several artificial mounds, the tops of which may occasionally rise to a height of from 60 to 80 feet above the surrounding country. The Greek historians attributed these artificial mounds to the wisdom of the kings, and especially to Sesostris, who, as they supposed, wished to raise the towns above the inundation. Some modern writers have even described the process, which they explain thus: a cellular framework of brick walls, like a huge chessboard, formed the superstructure, the cells being next filled in with earth, and the houses built upon this immense platform. But where I have excavated, especially at Thebes, I have never found anything answering to this conception. The intersecting walls which one finds beneath the later houses are nothing but the ruins of older dwellings, which in turn rest on others still older. The slightness of the foundations did not prevent the builders from boldly running up quite lofty structures. In the ruins of Memphis, I have observed walls still standing from 30 to 40 feet in height. the builders took no precautions beyond enlarging the base of the wall and vaulting the floors. The thickness of an ordinary wall was about 16 inches for a low house, but for one of several stories it was increased to 3 or 4 feet. Large beams, embedded here and there in the brickwork or masonry, bound the whole together and strengthened the structure. The ground floor was also frequently built with dressed stones, while the upper parts were of brick. The limestone of the neighbouring hills was the stone commonly used for such purposes. The fragments of sandstone, granite, and alabaster, which are often found mixed in with it, are generally from some ruined temple, the ancient Egyptians having pulled their neglected monuments to pieces quite as unscrupulously as do their modern successors. The houses of an ancient Egyptian town were clustered round its temple, and the temple stood in a rectangular enclosure to which access was obtained through monumental gateways in the surrounding brick wall. The gods dwelt in fortified mansions, or at any rate redoubts, to which the people of the place might fly for safety in the event of any sudden attack upon their town. Such towns as were built all at once by prince or king were fairly regular in plan, having wide paved streets at right angles to each other, and the buildings in line. The older cities, whose growth had been determined by the chances and changes of centuries, were characterized by no such regularity. Their houses stood in a maze of blind alleys, and narrow, dark, and straggling streets, with here and there a branch of a canal, almost dried up during the greater part of the year, and a muddy pond where the cattle drank and women came for water. Somewhere in each town was an open space shaded by sycamores or acacias, and hither on market days came the peasants of the district 2 or 3 times in the month. There were also waste places where rubbish and refuse was thrown, to be quarrelled over by vultures, hawks, and dogs. The lower classes lived in mere huts, which, though built of bricks, were no better than those of the present Fellahin. In Karnak, in the Pharaohic town, at Kom Ombo, in the Roman town, and at Medinet Habu, in the Coptic town, the houses in the poorer quarters have seldom more than 12 or 16 feet of frontage. They consist of a ground floor, with sometimes 1 or 2 living rooms above. The middle class folk, as shopkeepers, sub-officials, and foremen, were better housed. Their houses were brick-built and rather small, yet contained some half-dozen rooms communicating by means of doorways, which were usually arched over, and having vaulted roofs in some cases, and in others flat ones. Some few of the houses were 2 or 3 stories high, and many were separated from the street by a narrow court, beyond which the rooms were ranged on either side of a long passage. More frequently, the court was surrounded on 3 sides by chambers, and yet oftener the house fronted close upon the street. In the latter case, the façade consisted of a high wall, whitewashed or painted, and surmounted by a cornice. Even in better houses, the only ornamentation of their outer walls consisted in angular grooving, the grooves being surmounted by representations of 2 lotus flowers, each pair with the upper parts of the stalks in contact. The door was the only opening, save, perhaps, a few small windows, pierced at irregular intervals. Even in unpretentious houses, the door was often made of stone. The doorposts projected slightly beyond the surface of the wall, and the lintel supported a painted or sculptured cornice. Having crossed the threshold, one passed successively through 2 dimly lighted entrance chambers, the second of which opened into a central court. The best rooms in the houses of the wealthier citizens were sometimes lighted through a square opening in the centre of a ceiling supported on wooden columns. In the 12th dynasty town of Kahun, the shafts of these columns rested upon round stone bases. They were octagonal and about 10 inches in diameter. Notwithstanding the prevalence of enteric disease and ophthalmia, the family crowded together in 1 or 2 rooms during the winter, and slept out on the roof, under the shelter of mosquito nets, in summer. On the roof also, the women gossiped and cooked. The ground floor included both storerooms, barns, and stables. Private granaries were generally in pairs, brick-built in the same long canonical shape as the state granaries, and carefully plastered with mud inside and out. Neither did people of a house forget to find or make hiding places in the walls or floors of their home, where they could secrete their household treasures, such as nuggets of gold and silver, precious stones, and jewellery for men and women, from thieves and tax collectors alike. Wherever the upper floors still remained standing, they reproduced the ground floor plan with scarcely any differences. These upper rooms were reached by an outside staircase, steep and narrow, and divided at short intervals by small square landings. The rooms were oblong, and were lighted only from the doorway. When it was decided to open windows on the street, they were mere air holes near the ceiling, pierced without regularity or symmetry, fitted with a lattice of wooden crossbars, and secured by wooden shutters. The floors were bricked or paved, or consisted still more frequently of merely a layer of rammed earth. The rooms were not left undecorated. The mud plaster of the walls, generally in its native grey, although whitewashed in some cases, was painted with red or yellow, and ornamented with drawings of interior and exterior views of a house, and of household vessels and eatables. The roof was flat, and made probably, as at the present day, of closely laid rows of palm branches covered with a coating of mud thick enough to withstand the effects of rain. Sometimes it was surmounted by only one or two of the usual Egyptian ventilators, but generally there was a small wash house on the roof, and a little chamber for the slaves or guards to sleep in. The household fire was made in a hollow of the earthen floor, usually to one side of the room, and the smoke escaped through a hole in the ceiling. Branches of trees, charcoal, and dried cakes of ass or cow dung were used for fuel. The mansions of the rich and great covered a large space of ground. They most frequently stood in the midst of a garden, or of an enclosed court planted with trees, and, like the commoner houses, they turned a blank front to the street, consisting of bare walls, battlemented like those of a fortress. Thus home life was strictly secluded, and the pleasure of seeing was sacrificed for the advantage of not being seen. The door was approached by a flight of 2 or 3 steps, or by a porch supported on columns, and adorned with statues, which gave it a monumental appearance, and indicated the social importance of the family. Sometimes this was preceded by a pylon gateway, such as usually heralded the approach to a temple. Inside the enclosure it was like a small town, divided into quarters by irregular walls. The dwelling house stood at the farther end, the granaries, stabling, and open spaces being distributed in different parts of the grounds, according to some system to which we as yet possess no clue. These arrangements, however, were infinitely varied. If I would convey some idea of the residence of an Egyptian noble, a residence half palace, half villa, I cannot do better than reproduce 2 out of the many pictorial plans which have come down to us from the tomb paintings of the 18th century. The first represents a Theban house. This enclosure is square, and surrounded by an embattled wall. The main gate opens upon a road bordered with trees, which runs beside a canal, or perhaps an arm of the Nile. Low stone walls divide the garden into symmetrical compartments, like those which are seen to this day in the great gardens of Ekhmim or Gerger. In the centre is a large trellis supported on 4 rows of slender pillars. 4 small ponds, 2 to the right and 2 to the left, are stocked with ducks and geese. 2 nurseries, 2 summer houses, and various avenues of sycamores, date palms, and dom palms fill up the intermediate space, while at the end facing the entrance stands a small 3-storied house surmounted by a painted cornice. The second plan is copied from one of the rock-cut tombs of Tel el Amarna. Here we see a house situate at the end of the gardens of the great Lord Ai, son-in-law of the Pharaoh Khuenaten, and himself afterwards king of Egypt. An oblong stone tank with sloping sides and 2 descending flights of steps faces the entrance. The building is rectangular, the width being somewhat greater than the depth. A large doorway opens in the middle of the front, and gives access to a court planted with trees, and flanked by storehouses fully stocked with provisions. 2 small courts, placed symmetrically in the 2 farthest corners, contain the staircases which lead up to the roof terrace. This first building, however, is but the frame which surrounds the owner's dwelling. The 2 frontages are each adorned with a pillared portico and a pylon. Passing the outer door, we enter a sort of long central passage, divided by 2 walls pierced with doorways, so as to form 3 successive courts. The inside court is bordered by chambers, the other 2 open to right and left upon 2 smaller courts, whence flights of steps lead up to the terraced roof. This central building is called the Akonouti, or private dwelling of kings or nobles, to which only the family and intimate friends had access. The number of stories and the arrangement of the façade varied according to the taste of the owner. The frontage was generally a straight wall. Sometimes it was divided into 3 parts, with the middle division projecting, in which case the 2 wings were ornamented with a colonnade to each story, or surmounted by an open gallery. The central pavilion sometimes presents the appearance of a tower, which dominates the rest of the building. The façade is often decorated with slender colonnettes of painted wood, which bear no weight, and merely serve to lighten the somewhat severe aspect of the exterior. Of the internal arrangements we know but little. As in the middle-class houses, the sleeping rooms were probably small and dark, but, on the other hand, the reception rooms must have been nearly as large as those still in use in the Arab houses of modern Egypt. The decoration of walls and ceilings in no wise resembled such scenes or designs as we find in the tombs. The ceilings were usually left white. Sometimes, however, they were decorated with geometrical patterns, which repeated the leading motifs employed in the sepulchral wall paintings. Thus we find examples of meanders interspersed with rosettes, parti-coloured squares, ox heads seen frontwise, scrolls, and flights of geese. I have touched chiefly upon houses of the second Theban period, this being the time of which we have the most examples. The house-shaped lamps, which are found in such large numbers in the Fayum, date only from Roman times, but the Egyptians of that period continued to build according to the rules which were in force under the pharaohs of the 12th, 18th, 19th, and 20th dynasties. As regards the domestic architecture of the ancient kingdom, the evidences are few and obscure. Nevertheless, the stelae, tombs, and coffins of that period often furnish designs which show us the style of the doorways; and one 4th dynasty sarcophagus, that of Khufu Posku, is carved in the likeness of a house. End of Chapter 1, Section 1. Recording by Timothy Ferguson, Gold Coast, Australia. Chapter 1, Section 2 of Manual of Egyptian Archaeology and Guide to the Study of Antiquities in Egypt by Gaston Maspero, translated by Amelia B. Edwards. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Timothy Ferguson. Chapter 1, Architecture, Civil and Military. Section 2, Fortresses. Most of the towns, and even more of the larger villages of ancient Egypt, were walled. This was an almost necessary consequence of the geographical characteristics and the political constitution of the country. The mouths of the defiles which led into the desert needed to be closed against the Bedouin, while the great feudal nobles fortified their houses, their towns, and the villages upon their domains, which commanded either the mountain passes or the narrow parts of the river, against their king or their neighbours. The oldest fortresses are those of Abydos, El-Kab, and Semneh. Abydos contained a sanctuary dedicated to Osiris, and was situate at the entrance of one of the roads leading to the oasis. As the renown of the temple attracted pilgrims, so the position of the city caused it to be frequented by merchants. Hence the prosperity which it derived from the influx of both classes of strangers exposed the city to incursions of the Libyan tribes. At Abydos there yet remain 2 almost perfect strongholds. The older forms, as it were, the core of the tumulus, called by the Arabs Kom es Sultan, or the Mount of the King. The interior of this building has been excavated to a point some 10 or 12 feet above the ground level, but the walls outside have not yet been cleared from the surrounding sand and rubbish. In its present condition, it forms a parallelogram of crude brickwork, measuring 410 feet from north to south, and 223 feet from east to west. The main axis of the structure extends therefore from north to south. The principal gateway opens in the western wall, not far from the southwest corner, but there would appear to be two smaller gates, one in the south front and one in the east. The walls, which now stand from 24 to 36 feet high, have lost somewhat of their original height. They are about 6 feet thick at the top. They were not built altogether in uniform layers, but in huge vertical panels, easily distinguished by the arrangement of the brickwork. In one division, the bedding of the bricks is strictly horizontal; in the next it is slightly concave, and forms a very flat reversed arch, of which the extrados rests upon the ground. The alternation of these two methods is regularly repeated. The object of the arrangement is obscure, but it is said that buildings thus constructed are especially fitted to resist earthquake shocks. However this may be, the fortress is extremely ancient, for in the 5th dynasty the nobles of Abydos took possession of the interior, and ultimately so piled it up with their graves as to deprive it of all strategic value. A second stronghold, erected a few hundred yards further to the southeast, replaced that of Kom es Sultan about the time of the 12th dynasty, and narrowly escaped the fate of the first under the rule of the Ramessides. Nothing, in fact, but the sudden decline of the city saved the second from being similarly choked and buried. The early Egyptians possessed no engines calculated to make an impression on very massive walls. They knew of but 3 ways of forcing a stronghold, namely, scaling the walls, sapping them, or bursting open the gates. The plan adopted by their engineers in building the second fort is admirably well calculated to resist each of these modes of attack. The outer walls are long and straight, without towers or projections of any kind. They measure 430 feet in length from north to south, by 255 feet in width. The foundations rest on the sand, and do not go down more than a foot. The wall is of crude brick, in horizontal courses. It has a slight batter, is solid without slits or loopholes, and is decorated outside with long vertical grooves or panels, like those depicted on the stelae of the ancient empire. In its present state, it rises to a height of some 36 feet above the plain. When perfect, it would scarcely have exceeded 40 feet, which height would amply suffice to protect the garrison from all danger of scaling by portable ladders. The thickness of the wall is about 20 feet at the base, and 16 feet above. The top is destroyed, but the bas reliefs and mural paintings show that it must have been crowned with a continuous cornice, boldly projecting, furnished with a slight low parapet, and surmounted by battlements, which were generally rounded, but sometimes, though rarely, squared. The walk round the top of the ramparts, though diminished by the parapet, was still 12 or 15 feet wide. It ran uninterruptedly along the 4 sides, and was reached by narrow staircases formed in the thickness of the walls, but now destroyed. There was no ditch, but in order to protect the base of the main wall from sappers, they erected, about 10 feet in advance of it, a battlement covering wall, some 16 feet in height. These precautions sufficed against sap and scaling, but the gates remained as open gaps in the circuit. It was upon these weak points that besiegers and besieged alike concentrated their efforts. The fortress of Abydos had 2 gates, the main one being situate at the east end of the north front. A narrow cutting, closed by a massive wooden door, marked the place in the covering wall. Behind it was a small place d'armes, cut partly into the thickness of the wall, and leading to a second gate, as narrow as the first. When, notwithstanding the showers of missiles poured upon them from the tops of the walls, not only in front but also from both sides, the attacking party had succeeded in carrying this second door, they were not yet in the heart of the place. They would still have to traverse an oblong court, closely hemmed in between the outer walls and under the cross walls, which last stood at right angles to the first. Finally, they must force a last postern, which was purposely placed in the most awkward corner. The leading principle in the construction of fortress gates was always the same, but the details varied according to the taste of the engineer. At the south-east gate of the fort of Abydos, the place d'armes between the 2 walls is abolished, and the court is constructed entirely in the thickness of the main wall; while at Kom el Ahmar, opposite El Kab, the block of brickwork, in the midst of which the gate is cut, projects boldly in front. The posterns, opening at various points, facilitated the movements of the garrison, and enabled them to multiply their sorties. The same system of fortification which was in use for isolated fortresses was also employed for the protection of towns. At Heliopolis, at Sarn, at Sais, at Thebes, everywhere in short, we find long straight walls forming plain squares or parallelograms, without towers or bastions, ditches or outworks. The thickness of the walls, which varied from 30 to 80 feet, made such precautions needless. The gates, or at all events the principal ones, had jambs and lintels of stone, decorated with scenes and inscriptions, as, for instance, that of Ombos, which Champollion beheld yet in situ, and which dated from the reign of Thothmes III. The oldest and best preserved walled city in Egypt, namely El Kab, belongs to the ancient empire. The Nile washed part of it away some years ago, but at the beginning of the present century it formed an irregular quadrilateral enclosure, measuring some 2,100 feet in length by about a quarter less in breadth. The south front is constructed on the same principles as the wall at Kom Sultan, the bricks being bedded in alternate horizontal and concave sections. Along the north and west fronts they are laid in undulating layers from end to end. The thickness is 38 feet, and the average height 30 feet, and spacious ramps lead up to the walk upon the walls. The gates are placed irregularly, one in each side to north, east, and west, but none in the south face. They are, however, in too ruinous a state to admit of any plan being taken of them. The enclosure contained a considerable population, whose dwellings were unequally distributed, the greater part being concentrated towards the north and west, where excavations have disclosed the remnants of a large number of houses. The temples were grouped together in a square enclosure, concentric with the outer wall, and this second enclosure served for a keep, where the garrison could hold out long after the rest of the town had fallen into the hands of the enemy. The rectangular plan, though excellent in a plain, was not always available in hilly country. When the spot to be fortified was situate upon a height, the Egyptian engineers knew perfectly well how to adapt their lines of defence to the nature of the site. At Kom Ombo, the walls exactly followed the outline of the isolated mound on which the town was perched, and presented towards the east a front bristling with irregular projections, the style of which roughly resembles our modern bastions. At Kumeh and Seneh in Nubia, where the Nile rushes over the rocks of the Second Cataract, the engineering arrangements are very ingenious, and display much real skill. Usertesen III had fixed on this pass as the frontier of Egypt, and the fortresses which he there constructed were intended to bar the waterway against the vessels of the neighbouring negro tribes. At Kumeh, on the upper right bank, the position was naturally strong. Upon a rocky height surrounded by precipices was planned an irregular square measuring about 200 feet each way. Two elongated bastions, one on the north-east and the other on the south-east, guarded respectively the path leading to the gate and the course of the river. The covering wall stood 13 feet high, and closely followed the line of the main wall, except to the north and south corners, where it formed two bastion-like projections. At Semneh, on the opposite bank, the site was less favourable. The east side was protected by a belt of cliffs going sheer down to the water's edge, but the three other sides were well nigh open. A straight wall, about 50 feet in height, carried along the cliffs on the side next the river, but the walls looking towards the plain rose to 80 feet and bristled with bastion-like projections, jutting out for a distance of 50 feet from the curtain wall, measuring 30 feet thick at the base and 13 feet at the top, and irregularly spaced according to the requirements of the defence. These spurs, which are not battlemented, served in place of towers. They added to the strength of the walls, protected the walk round the top, and enabled the besieged to direct a flank attack against the enemy if any attempt were made upon the wall of circuit. The intervals between these spurs are accurately calculated as to distance, in order that archers should be able to sweep the intervening ground with their arrows. Curtains and salients are alike built of crude brick, with beams bedded horizontally into the mass. The outer face is in two parts, the lower division being nearly vertical, and the upper one inclined at an angle of about 70 degrees, which made scaling very difficult, if not impossible. The whole of the ground enclosed by the wall of circuit was filled in to nearly the level of the ramparts. Externally, the covering wall of stone was separated from the body of the fortress by a dry ditch, some 100 to 130 feet in width. This wall closely followed the main outline, and rose to a height which varied according to the situation from 6 to 10 feet above the level of the plain. On the northward side, it was cut by the winding road which led down into the plain. These arrangements, skilful as they were, did not prevent the fall of the place. A large breach in the southward face, between the two salients nearest to the river, marks the point of attack selected by the enemy. New methods of fortification were revealed to the Egyptians in the course of the great Asiatic wars undertaken by the pharaohs of the 18th dynasty. The nomadic tribes of Syria erected small forts in which they took refuge when threatened with invasion. The Canaanite and Hittite cities, as Ascalon, Dapur, and Merom, were surrounded by strong walls, generally built of stone, and flanked with towers. Those which stood in the open country, as for instance Qodshu, Kadesh, were enclosed by a double moat. Having proved the efficiency of these new types of defensive architecture in the course of their campaigns, the pharaohs reproduced them in the valley of the Nile. From the beginning of the 19th dynasty, the eastern frontier of the Delta, always the weakest, was protected by a line of forts constructed after the Canaanite model. The Egyptians, moreover, not content with appropriating the thing, appropriated also the name, and called these frontier towers by the Semitic name of Magdilu, or Migdols. For these purposes, or at all events for cities which were exposed to the incursions of the Asiatic tribes, brick was not deemed to be sufficiently strong. Hence the walls of Heliopolis and even those of Memphis were faced with stone. Of these new fortresses no ruins remain, but for a royal caprice which happens to have left us a model Migdol in that most unlikely place, the necropolis of Thebes. We should now be constrained to attempt a restoration of their probable appearance from the representations in certain mural tableaux. When, however, Rameses III erected his memorial temple, he desired, in remembrance of his Syrian victories, to give it an outwardly military aspect. Along the eastern front of the enclosure there accordingly runs a battlemented covered wall of stone, averaging some 13 feet in height. The gate, protected by a large quadrangular bastion, opened in the middle of this wall. It was 3 feet 4 inches in width, and was flanked by two small oblong guard houses, the flat roofs of which stood about 3 feet higher than the ramparts. Passing this gate, we stand face to face with a real Migdol. 2 blocks of building enclose a succession of courtyards, which narrow as they recede, and are connected at the lower end by a kind of gatehouse, consisting of one massive gateway surmounted by 2 stories of chambers. The eastward faces of the towers rise above an inclined basement, which slopes to a height from 15 to 16 feet from the ground. This answered 2 purposes. It increased the strength of the wall at the part exposed to sappers. It also caused the rebound of projectiles thrown from above, and so helped to keep assailants at a distance. The whole height is about 72 feet, and the width of each tower is 32 feet. The buildings situate at the back, to right and left of the gate, were destroyed in ancient times. The details of the decoration are partly religious, partly triumphal, as befits the character of the structure. It is unlikely, however, that actual fortresses were adorned with brackets and bas-relief sculptures, such as we here see on either side of the forecourt. Such as it is, the so-called pavilion of Medinet Habu offers an unique example of the high degree of perfection to which the victorious pharaohs of this period had carried their military architecture. Material evidence fails us almost entirely after the reign of Rameses III. Towards the close of the 11th century BC, the high priests of Amen repaired the walls of Thebes, of Gebelin, and of El Hibeh opposite Feshn. The territorial subdivisions of the country which took place under the successors of Seshnok compelled the provincial princes to multiply their strongholds. The campaign of Pianki on the banks of the Nile is a series of successful sieges. Nothing, however, leads us to suppose that the art of fortification had at that time made any distinct progress, and when the Greek rulers succeeded the native pharaohs, they most probably found it at much the same stage as it was left by the engineers of the 19th and 20th dynasties. End of Chapter 1, Section 2. Recording by Timothy Ferguson Gold Coast, Australia. Chapter 1, Part 3 of Manual of Egyptian Archaeology and Guide to the Study of Antiquities in Egypt by Gaston Maspero, translated by Amelia B. Edwards. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Timothy Ferguson. Chapter 1, Architecture, Civil and Military. Section 3, Public Works. A permanent network of roads would be useless in a country like Egypt. The Nile here is the natural highway for purposes of commerce, and the pathways which intersect the fields suffice for foot passengers, for cattle, and for the transport of goods from village to village. Ferry boats for crossing the river, fords wherever the canals were shallow enough, and embanked dams thrown up here and there where water was too deep for fordings, have completed the system of internal communication. Bridges were rare. Up to the present time, we know of but one in the whole territory of ancient Egypt, and whether that one was long or short, built of stone or wood, supported on arches, or boldly flung across the stream from bank to bank, we cannot even conjecture. The bridge, close under the very walls of Zaru, crossed the canal which separated the eastern frontier of Egypt from the desert regions of Arabia Petraea. A fortified enclosure protected this canal on the Asiatic side, as shown in the accompanying illustration. The maintenance of public highways, which figures as so costly an item in the expenses of modern nations, played, therefore, but a very small part in the annual disbursements of the pharaohs, who had only to provide for the due execution of three great branches of government works, namely storage, irrigation, mining, and quarrying. The taxation of ancient Egypt was levied in kind, and government servants were paid after the same system. To workmen there were monthly distributions of corn, oil, and wine, wherewith to support their families, while from end to end of the social scale each functionary, in exchange for his labour, received cattle, stuffs, manufactured goods, and certain quantities of copper or precious metals. Thus it became necessary that the treasury officials should have the command of vast storehouses for the safe keeping of the various goods collected under the head of taxation. These were classified and stored in separate quarters, each storehouse being surrounded by walls and guarded by vigilant keepers. There was enormous stabling for cattle. There were cellars where the amphorae were piled in regular layers, or hung in rows upon the walls, each with the date written on the side of the jar. There were oven-shaped granaries where the corn was poured in through a trap at the top, and taken out through a trap at the bottom. At Thuku, identified with Pithom by Monsieur Naville, the store chambers are rectangular and of different dimensions, originally divided by floors, and having no communication with each other. Here the corn had to not only be put in, but taken out through the aperture at the top. At the Ramesseum, Thebes, thousands of ostraka and jar stoppers found upon the spot prove that the brick-built remains at the back of the temple were the cellars of the local deity. The ruins consist of a series of vaulted chambers, originally surmounted by a platform or terrace. At Philae, Ombos, Daphnae, and most of the frontier towns of the Delta, there were magazines of this description, and many more will doubtless be discovered when made the object of serious exploration. The irrigation system of Egypt is but little changed since the olden time. Some new canals have been cut, and yet more have silted up through the negligence of those in power, but the general scheme and the methods employed continue much the same, and demand but little engineering skill. Wherever I have investigated the remains of ancient canals, I have been unable to detect any traces of masonry at the weak points, or at the mouths of these cuttings. They are mere excavated ditches from 20 to 60 or 70 feet in width. The earth flung out during the work was thrown to right and left, forming irregular embankments from 7 to 14 feet in height. The course of the ancient canals was generally straight, but that rule was not strictly observed, and enormous curves were often described in order to avoid even slight irregularities of surface. Dykes thrown up from the foot of the cliffs to the banks of the Nile divided the plain at intervals into a series of artificial basins, where the overflow formed backwaters at the time of inundation. These dykes are generally earthworks, though they are sometimes constructed of baked brick, as in the province of Gurgeh. Very rarely are they built of hewn stone, like that great dyke of Kashish, which was constructed by Mena in primeval times, in order to divert the course of the Nile from the spot on which he founded Memphis. The network of canals began near Silsilis, and extended to the seaboard without ever losing touch of the river, save at one spot near Beni Suef, where it throws out a branch in the direction of the Fayum. Here, through a narrow and sinuous gorge, deepened probably by the hand of man, it passes the rocky barrier which divides that low-lying province from the valley of the Nile, and thence expands into a fan-like ramification of innumerable channels. Having thus irrigated the district, the waters flow out again, those nearest the Nile returning by the same way that they have flowed in, while the rest form a series of lakes, the largest of which is known as the Birket el Kurun. If we are to believe Herodotus, the work was not so simply done. A king named Maurus desired to create a reservoir in the Fayum, which should neutralise the evil effects of insufficient or superabundant inundations. This reservoir was named, after him, Lake Maurus. If the supply fell below the average, then the stored waters were let loose, and Lower Egypt and the western delta were flooded to the needful height. If the next year the inundation came down in too great force, Lake Maurus received and stored the surplus till such a time as the waters began to subside. Two pyramids, each surmounted by a sitting colossus, one representing the king and the other his queen, were erected in the midst of the lake. Such is the tale told by Herodotus, and it is a tale which has considerably embarrassed our modern engineers and topographers. How, in fact, was it possible to find in the Fayum a site which could have contained a basin measuring at least 90 miles in circumference? Linnett supposed Lake Maurus to have extended over the whole of the low-lying land which skirts the Libyan cliffs, between Ilahun and Medinet el Fayum; but recent excavations have proved that the dykes by which this pretended reservoir was bounded are modern works, erected probably within the last 200 years. Major Brown has lately shown that the nucleus of Lake Maurus was the Birket el Kurun. This was known to the Egyptians as Miri, Mi-Uri, the Great Lake, whence the Greeks derived their Moiris, a name extended also to the inundation of the Fayum. If Herodotus did actually visit this province, it was probably in summer, at the time of the High Nile, when the whole district presents the appearance of an inland sea. What he took for the shores of this lake were the embankments which divided it into basins, and acted as highways between the various towns. His narrative, repeated by the classic authors, has been accepted by the moderns, and Egypt, neither accepting or rejecting it, was gratified long after date with the reputation of a gigantic work, which would in truth have been the glory of her civil engineers, if it had ever existed. I do not believe that Lake Moiris ever did exist. The only works of the kind which the Egyptians undertook were much less pretentious. These consist of stone-built dams erected at the mouths of many of those lateral ravines, or wadis, which lead down from the mountain ranges into the valley of the Nile. One of the most important among them was pointed out in 1885 by Dr. Schweinfurth, at a distance of about 6 miles and a half from the baths of Helwan, at the mouth of the great Wadi Geraweh. It answered two purposes: firstly, as a means of storing the water of the inundation for the use of the workmen in the neighbouring quarries; and secondly, as a barrier to break the force of the torrents which rush down from the desert after the heavy rains of springtime and winter. The ravine measures about 240 feet in width, the sides being on average from 40 to 50 feet in height. The dam, which is 143 feet in thickness, consists of 3 layers of material. At the bottom, a bed of clay and rubble; next, a piled mass of limestone blocks; lastly, a wall of cut stone, built in retreating stages, like an enormous flight of steps. 32 of the original 35 stages are yet in situ, and about 1/4 part of the dam remains piled up against the sides of the ravine to right and left, but the middle part has been swept away by the force of the torrent. A similar dike transformed the end of Wadi Gene into a little lake, which supplied the Sinaitic miners with water. Most of the localities from which the Egyptians derived their metals and choicest materials in hard stone were difficult to access, and would have been useless had roads not been made, and works of this kind carried out, so as to make life somewhat less insupportable there. In order to reach the diorite and grey granite quarries of the Hammamat Valley, the Pharaohs caused a series of rock-cut cisterns to be constructed along the line of the route. Some few insignificant springs, skilfully constructed into these reservoirs, made it possible to plant workmen's villages in the neighbourhood of the quarries, and also near the emerald mines on the border of the Red Sea. Hundreds of hired labourers, slaves, and condemned criminals here led a wretched existence, under the rule of some 8 or 10 overseers, and the brutal surveillance of a company of Libyan or negro mercenary troops. The least political disturbance in Egypt, an unsuccessful campaign, or any untoward incident of a troubled reign, sufficed to break up the precarious stability of these remote establishments. The Bedouin at once attacked the colony, the workmen deserted, the guards, weary of exile, hastened back to the valley of the Nile, and all was at a standstill. The choicest materials, as diorite, basalt, black granite, porphyry, and red and yellow breccia, which are only found in the desert, were rarely used for architectural purposes. In order to procure them, it was necessary to organise regular expeditions of soldiers and workmen. Therefore they were reserved for sarcophagi and important works of art. Those quarries which supplied building materials for temples and funerary monuments, such as limestone, sandstone, alabaster, and red granite, were all found in the Nile Valley, and were therefore easy of access. When the vein which was intended to work traversed the lower strata of the rock, the miners excavated chambers and passages, which were often prolonged to a considerable distance. Square pillars, left standing at intervals, supported the superincumbent mass, while tablets, sculptured in the most conspicuous places, commemorated the kings and engineers who began or continued the work. Several exhausted or abandoned quarries have been transformed into votive chapels, as, for instance, the Speos Artemidos, which was consecrated by Hatshepsut, Thothmes III, and Seti I, to the local goddess Parket. The most important limestone quarries are at Tura and Masara, nearly opposite Memphis. This stone lends itself admirably to the most delicate touches of the chisel, hardens when exposed to the air, and acquires a creamy tone most restful to the eye. Hence it was much in request by architects and sculptors. The most extensive sandstone formations are at Silsilis. Here the cliffs are quarried from above, and under the open sky. Clean cut and absolutely vertical, they rise at a height of from 40 to 50 feet, sometimes presenting a smooth surface from top to bottom, and sometimes cut in stages accessible by means of steps scarcely large enough for one man at a time. The walls of these cuttings are covered with parallel striae, sometimes horizontal, sometimes slanting to the left, and sometimes to the right, so forming lines of serried chevrons, framed, as it were, between grooves an inch or an inch and a half in width by 9 or 10 feet in length. These are the scars left upon the surface by the tools of the ancient workmen, and they show the method employed in detaching the blocks. The size was outlined in red ink, and this outline sometimes indicated the form which the stone was to take in the projected building. The members of the French Commission, when they visited the quarries of Gebel Abefede, copied the diagrams and squared designs of several capitals, one being of the campaniform pattern, and others prepared for the Hathor head pattern. The outline made, the vertical faces of the block were divided by means of a long iron chisel, which was driven in perpendicularly or obliquely by heavy blows of the mallet. In order to detach the horizontal faces, they made use of wooden or bronze wedges, inserted the way of the natural strata of the stone. Very frequently the stone was roughly blocked out before being actually extracted from the bed. Thus at Syene, Assuan, we see a concave obelisk of granite, the underside of which is one with the rock itself, and at Tene there are drums of columns but half disengaged. The transport of quarried stone was effected in various ways. At Syene, at Silsis, at Gebel Sheikh Herideh, and at Gebel Abefide, the quarries are literally washed by the waters of the Nile, so that the stone was lowered at once into the barges. At Kasa es Said, at Tura, and other localities situate at some distance from the river, canals dug expressly for the purpose conveyed the transport boats to the foot of the cliffs. When water transit was out of the question, the stone was placed on sledges drawn by oxen, or dragged to its destination by gangs of labourers, and by the help of rollers. End of Chapter 1, Section 3. Recording by Timothy Ferguson, Gold Coast, Australia. Chapter 2, Section 1 of Manual of Egyptian Archaeology and Guide to the Study of Antiquities in Egypt by Gaston Maspero, translated by Amelia B. Edwards. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Timothy Ferguson. Chapter 2, Religious Architecture. Section 1, Materials, Principles of Construction. In the civil and military architecture of ancient Egypt, brick played the principal part, but in the religious architecture of the nation it occupied a very secondary position. The pharaohs were ambitious of building eternal dwellings for their deities, and stone was the only material which seemed sufficiently durable to withstand the ravages of time and man. 1. Materials and Principles of Construction. It is an error to suppose that the Egyptians employed only large blocks for building purposes. The size of their materials varied very considerably according to the uses for which they were destined. Architraves, drums of columns, lintel stones, and door jambs were sometimes of great size. The longest architraves known, those, namely, which bridge the nave of the hypostyle hall of Karnak, have a mean length of 30 feet. They each contain 40 cubic yards and weigh about 65 tons. Ordinarily, however, the blocks are not much larger than those now used in Europe. They measure, that is to say, about 2.5 to 4 feet in height, from 3 to 8 feet in length, and from 2 to 6 feet in thickness. Some temples are built of only one kind of stone, but more frequently materials of different kinds are put together in unequal proportions. Thus the main part of the temples of Abydos consists of very fine limestone, but in the temple of Seti I, the columns, architraves, jambs, and lintels, all parts in short where it might be feared that the limestone would not offer sufficient resistance, the architect has had recourse to sandstone, while in that of Rameses II, sandstone, granite, and alabaster were used. At Karnak, Luxor, Tanis, and Memphis, similar combinations may be seen. At the Ramesseum and in some of the Nubian temples, the columns stand on massive supports of crude brick. The stones were dressed more or less carefully according to the positions they were to occupy. When the walls were of medium thickness, as in most partition walls, they are well wrought on all sides. When the wall is thick, the core blocks were roughed out as nearly cubic as might be, and piled together without much care, the hollows being filled up with smaller flakes, pebbles, or mortar. Casing stones were carefully wrought on their faces, and the joints dressed for 2/3 or 3/4 of the length, the rest being merely picked with a point. The largest blocks were reserved for the lower parts of the building, and this precaution was the more necessary because the architects of Pharaonic times sank the foundations of their temples no deeper than those of their houses. At Karnak, they are not carried lower than from 7 to 10 feet. At Luxor, on the side anciently washed by the river, 3 courses of masonry, each measuring about 2.5 feet in depth, form a great platform on which the walls rest, while at the Ramesseum, the brickwork bed on which the colonnade stands does not seem to be more than 10 feet deep. These are but slight depths for the foundations of such great buildings, but the experience of ages proves that they are sufficient. The hard and compact humus of which the soil of the Nile Valley is composed contracts every year after the subsidence of the inundation, and thus becomes almost incompressible. As the building progressed, the weight of the superincumbent masonry gradually became greater, till the maximum of pressure was attained, and a solid basis secured. Wherever I have bared the foundations of the walls, I can testify that they have not shifted. The system of construction in force amongst the ancient Egyptians resembles in many respects that of the Greeks. The stones are often placed together with dry joints, and without the employment of any binding contrivance, the masons relying on the mere weight of the materials to keep them in place. Sometimes they are held together by metal cramps, or sometimes, as in the temple of Seti I at Abydos, by dovetails of sycamore wood bearing the cartouche of the founder. Most commonly, they are united by a mortar joint more or less thick. All the mortars of which I have collected samples are thus far of 3 kinds. The first is white and easily reduced to an impalpable powder, being of lime only. The others are grey and rough to the touch, being mixtures of lime and sand, while some are of a reddish colour owing to the pounded brick powder with which they are mixed. A judicious use of these various methods enabled the Egyptians to rival the Greeks in their treatment of regular courses, equal blocks, and upright joints in alternate bond. If they did not always work equally well, their shortcomings must be charged to the imperfect mechanical means at their disposal. The enclosure walls, partitions, and secondary facades were upright, and they raised the materials by means of a rude kind of crane planted on the top. The pylon walls and the principal facades, and sometimes even the secondary facades, were sloped at an angle which varied according to the taste of the architect. In order to build these, they formed inclined planes, the slopes of which were lengthened as the structure rose in height. These two methods were equally perilous, for however carefully the blocks might be protected while being raised, they were constantly in danger of losing their edges or corners, or of being fractured before they reached the top. Thus it was almost always necessary to rework them, and the object being to sacrifice as little as possible of the stone, the workmen often left them of the most abnormal shapes. They would level off one of the side faces, and then the joint, instead of being vertical, leaned askew. If the block had neither height nor length to spare, they made up the loss by means of a supplementary slip. Sometimes even they left a projection which fitted into a corresponding hollow in the next upper or lower course. Being, first of all, expedients designed to remedy accidents, these methods degenerated into habitually careless ways of working. The masons who had inadvertently hoisted too large a block no longer troubled themselves to lower it back again, but worked it into the building in one or the other of the ways before mentioned. The architect neglected to duly supervise the dressing and placing of the blocks. He allowed the courses to vary, and the vertical joints, 2 or 3 deep, to come one over the other. The rough work done, the masons dressed down the stone, reworked the joints, and overlaid the whole with a coat of cement or stucco, coloured to match the material, which concealed the faults of the real work. The walls rarely end with a sharp edge. Bordered with a torus, around which a sculptured riband is entwined, they are crowned by the cavetto cornice, surmounted by a flat band, or, as at Semneh, by a square cornice, or, as at Medinet Habu, by a line of battlements. Thus framed in, the walls looked like enormous panels, each panel complete in itself, without projections, and almost without openings. Windows, always rare in Egyptian architecture, are mere ventilators when introduced into the walls of temples, being intended to light the staircases, as in the second pylon of Horemheb at Karnak, or else to support decorative woodwork on festival days. The doorways project but slightly from the body of the buildings, except where the lintel is overshadowed by a projecting cornice. Real windows occur only in the pavilion of Medinet Habu, but that building was constructed on the model of a fortress, and must rank as an exception among religious monuments. The ground level of the courts and halls was flagged with rectangular paving stones, well enough fitted, except in the intercolumniations, where the architects, hopeless of harmonising the lines of the pavement with the curved bases of the columns, have filled in the space with small pieces set without order or method. Contrary to their practice when house building, they have scarcely ever employed the vault or arch in temple architecture. We nowhere meet with it except at Deir el Bahari, and in the 7 parallel sanctuaries at Abydos. Even in these instances, the arch is produced by corbelling. That is to say, the curve is formed by 3 or 4 superimposed horizontal courses of stone, chiselled out to the form required. The ordinary roofing consists of flat paving slabs. Where the space between the walls was not too wide, these slabs bridged over at a single stretch. Otherwise, the roof had to be supported at intervals, and the wider the space, the more these supports needed to be multiplied. The supports were connected by immense stone architraves, on which the roofing slabs rested. The supports are of 2 types, the pillar and the column. Some are cut from single blocks, thus the monolithic pillars of the Temple of the Sphinx, the oldest hitherto found, measure 16 feet in height by 4.5 feet in width. Monolithic columns of red granite are also found among the ruins of Alexandria Bubastis and Memphis, which date from the reigns of Horemheb and Ramesses II, and measure some 20 to 26 feet in height. But columns and pillars are commonly built in courses, which are often unequal and irregular, like those of the walls which surround them. The great columns of Luxor are not even solid. 2/3 of the diameter being filled up with yellow cement, which has lost its strength and crumbles between the fingers. The capital of the column of Takhara at Karnak contains 3 courses, each about 48 inches high. The last and most projecting course is made up of 26 convergent stones, which are held in place by merely the weight of the abacus. The same carelessness which we have already noted in the workmanship of the walls is found in the workmanship of the columns. The quadrangular pillar, with parallel or slightly inclined sides, and generally without either base or capital, frequently occurs in tombs of the ancient empire. It reappears later in Medinet Habu, in the temple of Thothmes III, and again at Karnak, in what is known as the processional hall. The sides of these square pillars are often covered with painted scenes, while the front faces were more decoratively treated, being sculptured with lotus or papyrus stems in high relief, as on the pillar stele of Karnak, or adorned with a head of Hathor crowned with the sistrum, as in the small speos of Abu Simbel, or sculptured with a full-length standing figure of Osiris, as in the second court of Medinet Habu, or as at Dendera or Gebel Bakal, with the figure of the god Bez. At Karnak, in an edifice which was probably erected by Horemheb with building material taken from the ruins of a sanctuary of Amenhotep II and III, the pillar is capped by a cornice, separated from the architrave by a thin abacus. By cutting away its 4 edges, the square pillar becomes an octagonal prism, and further, by cutting off the 8 new edges, it becomes a 16-sided prism. Some pillars in the tombs of Aswan and Beni Hassan, and in the processional hall at Karnak, as well as in the chapels of Deir el-Bahri, are of this type. Besides the forms thus regularly evolved, there are others of irregular derivation, with 6, 12, 15, or 20 sides, or verging almost upon a perfect circle. The portico pillars of the Temple of Osiris at Abydos come last in the series. The drum is curved but not round, the curve being interrupted at both extremities of the same diameter by a flat stripe. More frequently, the sides are slightly channelled, and sometimes, as at Kalabsheh, the flutings are divided into 4 groups of 5 each by 4 vertical flat stripes. The polygonal pillar has always a large shallow plinth in the form of a rounded disc. At El Kab it bears the head of Hathor, sculptured in relief upon the front, but almost everywhere else it is crowned with a simple square abacus, which joins it to the architrave. Thus treated, it bears a certain family likeness to the Doric column, and one understands how Jomard and Champollion, in the first ardour of discovery, were tempted to give it the scarcely justifiable name of Proto-Doric. The column does not rest immediately upon the soil. It is always furnished with a base like that of the polygonal pillar, sometimes square with the ground, and sometimes slightly rounded. This base is either plain or ornamented only with a line of hieroglyphs. The principal forms fall into 3 types: 1, the column with campaniform or lotus flower capital; 2, the column with lotus bud capital; 3, the column with Hathor head capital. 1. Columns with campaniform capitals. The shaft is generally plain, or merely engraved with inscriptions or bas reliefs. Sometimes, however, as at Medamot, it is formed by 6 large and 6 small colonnettes in alternation. In Pharaonic times it is bulbous, being curved inward at the base, and ornamented with triangles, one within another, imitating the large leaves which sheathe the sprouting plant. The curve is so regulated that the diameter at the base and the top shall be about equal. In the Ptolemaic period, the bulb often disappears, owing probably to Greek influences. The columns which surround the first court at Edfu rise straight from their plinths. The shaft always tapers towards the top. It is finished by 3 or 5 flat bands, one above the other. At Medamot, where the shaft is clustered, the architect has doubtless thought that one tie at the top appeared insufficient to hold a dozen colonnettes. He has therefore marked 2 other rings of bands at regular intervals. The campaniform capital is decorated from the spring of the curve with a row of leaves, like those which sheathe the base. Between these are figured shoots of lotus and papyrus in flower and bud. The height of the capital and the extent of its projection beyond the line of the shaft varied with the taste of the architect. At Luxor, the campaniform capitals are 11½ feet in diameter at the neck, 18 feet in diameter at the top, and 11½ feet in height. At Karnak, in the hypostyle hall, the height of the capital is 12¼ feet, and the greatest diameter 21 feet. A square die surmounts the whole. This die is almost hidden by the curve of the capital, though occasionally, as at Dendera, it is higher, and bears on each face a figure of the god Bes. The column with campaniform capital is mostly employed in the middle avenue of hypostyle halls, as at Karnak, the Ramesseum, and Luxor; but it was not restricted to this position, for we also find it in porticos, as at Medinet Habu, Edfu, and Philae. The processional hall of Thothmes III at Karnak contains one most curious variety. The flower is inverted like a bell, and the shaft is turned upside down, the smaller end being sunk into the plinth, while the larger is fitted to the wide part of the overturned bell. This ungraceful innovation achieved no success, and is found nowhere else. Other novelties were happier, especially those which enabled the artist to introduce decorative elements taken from the flora of the country. In the earlier examples at Soleb, Seseba, Bubastis, and Memphis, we find a crown of palm branches springing from the band, their heads being curved beneath the weight of the abacus. Later on, as we approach the Ptolemaic period, the date and the half-unfolded lotus were added to the palm branches. Under the Ptolemies and the Caesars, the capital became a complete basket of flowers and leaves, ranged row above row, and painted in the brightest colours. At Edfu, Ombos, and Philae, one would fancy that the designer had vowed never to repeat the same pattern in the same portico. 2. Columns with lotus bud capitals. Originally, these may perhaps have represented a bunch of lotus plants, the buds being bound together at the neck to form the capital. The columns of Beni Hassan consist of 4 rounded stems. Those of the labyrinth of the processional hall of Thothmes III and of Medamot consist of 8 stems, each presenting a sharp edge on the outer side. The bottom of the column is bulbous, and set round with triangular leaves. The top is surrounded by 3 or 5 bands. A moulding composed of groups of 3 vertical stripes hangs like a fringe from the lowest band in the space between every 2 stems. So varied a surface does not admit of hieroglyphic decoration, therefore the projections were by degrees suppressed, and the whole shaft was made smooth. In the hypostyle hall at Gurneh, the shaft is divided in 3 parts, the middle one being smooth and covered with sculptures, while the upper and lower divisions are formed of clustered stems. In the temple of Khonsû, in the aisles of the hypostyle hall of Karnak, and in the portico of Medinet Habu, the shaft is quite smooth, the fringe alone being retained below the top bands, while a slight ridge between each of the 3 bands recalls the original stems. The capital underwent a like process of degradation. At Beni Hassan, it is finely clustered throughout its height. In the processional hall of Thothmes III at Luxor, and at Medamot, a circle of small pointed leaves and channellings around the base lessens the effect, and reduces it to a mere grooved and truncated cone. In the hypostyle hall at Karnak, at Abydos, at the Ramesseum, and at Medinet Habu, various other ornaments, as triangular leaves, hieroglyphic inscriptions, or bands of cartouches, flanked by uraei, fill the space thus unfortunately obtained. Neither is the abacus hidden, as in the campaniform capital, but stands out boldly and displays the cartouche of the royal founder. 3. Columns with Hathor-headed capitals. We find examples of the Hathor-headed column dating from ancient times, as at Deir el-Bahri, but this order is best known in buildings of the Ptolemaic period, as at Contra Latopolis, Philae, and Dendera. The shaft and base present no special characteristics. They resemble those of campaniform columns. The capital is in 2 divisions. Below we have a square block, bearing on each face a woman's head in high relief, and crowned with a naos. The woman has the ears of a heifer. Her hair, confined over the brow by 3 vertical bands, falls behind the ears, and hangs long on the shoulders. Each head supports a fluted cornice, on which stands a naos framed between 2 volutes, and crowned by a slender abacus. Thus each column has for its capitals 4 heads of Hathor. Seen from a distance, it at once recalls the form of the sistrum, so frequently represented in the bas-reliefs as held in the hands of queens and goddesses. It is, in fact, a sistrum, in which the regular proportions of the parts are disregarded. The handle is gigantic, while the upper part of the instrument is unduly reduced. This notion so pleased the Egyptian fancy that architects did not hesitate to combine the sistrum design with elements borrowed from other orders. The 4 heads of Hathor, placed above a campaniform capital, furnished Nectanebo with a composite type for his pavilion at Philae. I cannot say that the compound is very satisfactory, but the column is, in reality, less ugly than it appears in engravings. Shafts of columns were regulated by no fixed rules of proportion or arrangement. The architect might, if he chose, make use of equal heights with very different diameters, and, regardless of any considerations apart from those of general harmony, might design the various parts according to whatever scale best suited him. The dimensions of the capital had no invariable connection with those of the shaft, nor was the height of the shaft dependent on the diameter of the column. At Karnak, the campaniform columns of the hypostyle hall measure 10 feet high in the capital and 55 feet high in the shaft, with a lower diameter of 11 feet 8 inches. At Luxor, the capital measures 11.5 feet, the shaft 49 feet, and the diameter at the spring of the base 11.25 feet. At the Ramesseum, the shaft and capital measure 35 feet, and the spring diameter is 6.5 feet. The lotus bud or clustered column gives similar results. At Karnak, in the aisles of the hypostyle hall, the capital is 10 feet high, the shaft 33 feet, and the base diameter 6.75 feet. At the Ramesseum, the capital is 5.5 feet high, the shaft 24.5 feet, and the base diameter 5 feet 10 inches. We find the same irregularity as to architraves. Their height is determined only by the taste of the architect or the necessities of the building. So also with the spacing of columns. Not only does the intercolumnar space vary considerably between temple and temple, or chamber and chamber, but sometimes, as in the first court at Medinet Habu, they vary in the same portico. We have thus far treated separately of each type, but when various types were associated in a single building, no fixed relative proportions were observed. In the hypostyle hall at Karnak, the campaniform columns support the nave, while the lotus bud variety is relegated to the aisles. There are halls in the temple of Khonsu where the lotus bud column is the loftiest, and others where the campaniform dominates the rest. In what remains of the Medamot structure, campaniform and lotus bud columns are of equal height. Egypt had no definite orders like those of Greece, but tried every combination to which the elements of the column could be made to lend themselves. Hence we can never determine the dimensions of an Egyptian column from those of one of its parts. End of Chapter 2, Section 1. Reading by Timothy Ferguson, Gold Coast, Australia. Chapter 2, Section 2 of Manual of Egyptian Archaeology and Guide to the Study of Antiquities in Egypt by Gaston Maspero, translated by Amelia B. Edwards. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Timothy Ferguson. Chapter 2, Religious Architecture. Section 2, Temples. Most of the famous sanctuaries, Dendera, Edfu, Abydos, were founded before Mena by the servants of Hor. Becoming dilapidated or ruined in the course of ages, they have been restored, rebuilt, remodelled, one after the other, till nothing remains of the primitive design to show us what the first Egyptian architecture was like. The funerary temples built by the kings of the 4th dynasty have left some traces. That of the second pyramid of Giza was so far preserved at the beginning of the last century that Mallet saw 4 large pillars standing. It is now almost entirely destroyed, but this loss has been more than compensated by the discovery in 1853 of a temple situate about 50 yards to the southward of the Sphinx. The facade is still hidden by the sand, and inside is but partly uncovered. The core masonry is of fine Tura limestone. The casing, pillars, architraves, and roof were constructed with immense blocks of alabaster or red granite. The plan is most simple. In the middle is a great hall in the shape of the letter T, adorned with 16 square pillars, 16 feet in height. At the northwest corner of this hall is a narrow passage on an inclined plane, by which the building is now entered. At the southwest corner is a recess which contains 6 niches in pairs, one over the other. A long gallery opening at each end into a square chamber, now filled with rubbish, completes the plan. Without any main door, without windows, and entered through a passage too long to admit the light of day, the building can only have received light and air through slanting air slits in the roofing, of which traces are yet visible on the tops of the walls, on each side of the main hall. Inscriptions, bas reliefs, paintings, such as we are accustomed to find everywhere in Egypt, are all wanting, and yet these bare walls produce as great an impression upon the spectator as the richly decorated temples of Thebes. Not only grandeur, but sublimity has been achieved in the mere juxtaposition of blocks of granite and alabaster, by means of purity of line and exactness of proportion. Some few scattered ruins in Nubia, the Fayum, and Sinai do not suffice to prove whether the temples of the 12th dynasty merited the praises lavished on them in the contemporary inscriptions or not. Those of the Theban kings, of the Ptolemies, and of the Caesars which are yet standing are, in some cases, nearly perfect, whilst almost all are easy of restoration to those who conscientiously study them upon the spot. At first sight they seem to present an infinite variety as to the arrangement, but on a closer view they are found to conform to a single type. We will begin with the sanctuary. This is a low, small, obscure, rectangular chamber, inaccessible to all save Pharaoh and the priests. As a rule, it contained neither statue nor emblem, but only the sacred bark, or a tabernacle of painted wood, placed upon a pedestal. A niche in the wall, or an isolated shrine formed of a single block of stone, received on certain days the statue or inanimate symbol of the local god, or the living animal or the image of the animal sacred to that god. A temple must necessarily contain this one chamber, and if it contained but this one chamber, it would be no less a temple than the most complex buildings. Very rarely, however, especially in large towns, was the service of the gods thus limited to the strictly necessary. Around the sanctuary, or divine house, was grouped a series of chambers in which sacrificial and ceremonial objects were stored, as flowers, perfumes, stuffs, and precious vessels. In advance of this block of buildings were next built one or more halls supported on columns, and in advance of these came a courtyard where the priests and devotees assembled. This courtyard was surrounded by a colonnade, to which the public had access, and was entered through a gateway, flanked by two towers, in front of which were placed statues or obelisks, the whole being surrounded by an enclosure wall of brickwork, and approached through an avenue of sphinxes. Every pharaoh was free to erect a hall still more sumptuous in front of those which his predecessors had built, and what he did others might do after him. Thus, successive series of chambers and courts, of pylons and porticos, were added reign after reign to the original nucleus, and, vanity or piety prompting the work, the temple continued to increase in every direction till space or means had failed. The most simple temples were sometimes the most beautiful. This was the case as regards the sanctuaries erected by Amenhotep III in the island of Elephantine, which were figured by the members of the French expedition at the end of the last century, and destroyed by the Turkish governor of Aswan in 1822. The best preserved, namely the South Temple, consisted of but a single chamber of sandstone, 14 feet high, 31 feet wide, and 39 feet long. The walls, which were straight, and crowned with the usual cornice, rested on a platform of masonry some 8 feet above the ground. This platform was surrounded by a parapet wall, breast high. All around the temple ran a colonnade, the sides each consisting of 7 square pillars without a capital or base, and the 2 facades, front and back, being supported by 2 columns with the lotus bud capital. Both pillars and columns rose direct from the parapet, except on the east front, where a flight of 10 or 12 steps, enclosed between 2 walls of the same height as the platform, led up to the cella. The 2 columns in the head of the steps were wider apart than those of the opposite face, and through the space thus opened was seen a richly decorated door. A second door opened at the other end, beneath the portico. Later, in Roman times, this feature was utilised in altering the building. The intercolumnar space at the end was filled up, and thus was obtained a second hall, rough and bare, but useful for the purposes of the temple service. These Elephantine sanctuaries bring to mind the peripteral temples of the Greeks, and this resemblance to one of the most familiar forms of classical architecture explains perhaps the boundless admiration with which they were regarded by the French savants. Those of Meshiqa, of El Kab, and of Sharonah are somewhat more elaborate. The building at El Kab is in 3 divisions: first, a hall of 4 columns; next, a chamber supported by 4 Hathor-headed pillars; and at the end wall, opposite the door, a niche approached by 4 steps. Of these small oratories, the most complete model now remaining belongs to the Ptolemaic period, namely the Temple of Hathor at Deir el Medineh. Its length is just double its breadth. The walls are built with a batter inclining inwards, and are externally bare, save at the door, which is framed in a projecting border covered with finely sculptured scenes. The interior is in three parts: a portico supported by two lotus flower columns, a pronaos reached by a flight of 4 steps, and separated from the portico by a wall which connects the two lotus flower columns with two Hathor-headed pilasters in antis; lastly, the sanctuary, flanked by two small chambers, which are lighted by square openings cut in the ceiling. The ascent to the terrace is by way of a staircase, very ingeniously placed in the south corner of the portico, and furnished with a beautiful open window. This is merely a temple in miniature, but the parts, though small, are so well proportioned that it would be impossible to conceive of anything more delicate or graceful. We cannot say as much for the temple which the pharaohs of the 20th dynasty erected at the south of Karnak, in honour of the god Khonsû; but if the style is not irreproachable, the plan is nevertheless so clear that one is tempted to accept it as the type of an Egyptian temple, in preference to others more elegant or majestic. On analysis, it resolves itself into two parts separated by a thick wall. In the centre of the lesser division is the Holy of Holies, open at both ends, and isolated from the rest of the building by a surrounding passage, 10 feet in width. To the right and left of this sanctuary are small dark chambers, and behind it is a hall of 4 columns, from which open 7 other chambers. Such was the house of the god, having no communication with the adjoining parts except by 2 doors in the southern wall. These opened into a wide and shallow hypostyle hall, divided into nave and aisles. The nave is supported by 4 lotus flower columns 23 feet in height, and aisles each contain 2 lotus bud columns 18 feet in height. The roof of the nave is therefore 5 feet higher than that of the sides. This elevation was made use of for lighting purposes, the clerestory being fitted with stone gratings which admitted the daylight. The court was square and surrounded by a double colonnade, entered by way of 4 side gates and a great central gateway, flanked by 2 quadrangular towers with sloping fronts. This pylon measures 105 feet in length, 33 feet in width, and 60 feet in height. It contains no chambers, but only a narrow staircase, which leads to the top of the gate and thence up to the towers. 4 long grooves in the façade, reaching to a third of its height, correspond to 4 quadrangular openings cut through the whole thickness of the masonry. Here were fixed 4 great wooden masts, formed of jointed beams, and held in place by a wooden framework fixed in the 4 openings above mentioned. From these masts floated long streamers of various colours. Such was the temple of Khonsû, and such in their main features were the majority of the greater temples of Theban and Ptolemaic times, as Luxor, the Ramesseum, Medinet Habu, Edfu, and Dendra. Though for the most part in ruins, they affect one with a strange and disquieting sense of oppression. As mystery was a favourite attribute of the Egyptian gods, even so the plan of their temples is in such wise devised as to lead gradually from the full sunshine of the outer world to the obscurity of their retreats. At the entrance we find large open spaces, where air and light stream freely in. The hypostyle hall is pervaded by a sober twilight. The sanctuary is more than half lost in a vague darkness, and at the end of the building, in the farthest of the chambers, night all but reigns completely. The effect of distance which was produced by this gradual diminution of light was still further heightened by various structural artifices. The parts, for instance, are not on the same level. The ground rises from the entrance, and there are always a few steps to mount in passing from one part to another. In the temple of Khonsû, the difference of level is not more than 5¼ feet, but it is combined with a lowering of the roof, which in most cases is very strongly marked. From the pylon to the wall at the farther end, the height decreases continuously. The peristyle is loftier than the hypostyle hall, and the hypostyle hall is loftier than the sanctuary. The last hall of columns and the farthest chamber are lower and lower still. The architects of Ptolemaic times changed certain details of arrangement. They erected chapels and oratories on the terraced roofs, and reserved space for the construction of secret passages and crypts in the thickness of the walls, wherein to hide the treasures of the god. They, however, introduced only two important modifications of the original plan. The sanctuary was formerly entered by two opposite doors; they left but one. Also the colonnade, which was originally continued round the upper end of the court, or, where there was no court, along the façade of the temple, became now the pronaos, so forming an additional chamber. The columns of the outer row are retained, but built into a wall reaching to about half their height. This connecting wall is surmounted by a cornice, which thus forms a screen, and so prevented the outer throng from seeing what took place within. The pronaos is supported by 2, 3, or even 4 rows of columns, according to the size of the edifice. For the rest, it is useful to compare the plan of the temple of Edfu with that of the temple of Khonsû, observing how little they differ the one from the other. Thus designed, the building sufficed for all the needs of worship. If enlargement was needed, the sanctuary and surrounding chambers were generally left untouched, and only the ceremonial parts of the building, as the hypostyle halls, the courts, or pylons, were attacked. The procedure of the Egyptians under these circumstances is best illustrated by the history of the great temple of Karnak. Founded by Usertesen I, probably on the site of a still earlier temple, it was but a small building constructed of limestone and sandstone, with granite doorways. The inside was decorated with 16-sided pillars. The second and third Amenemhats added some work to it, and the princes of the 13th and 14th dynasties adorned it with statues and tables of offerings. It was still unaltered when, in the 18th century BC, Thothmes I, enriched with booty of war, resolved to enlarge it. In advance of what already stood there, he erected 2 chambers, preceded by a court and flanked by 2 isolated chapels. In advance of these again, he erected 3 successive pylons, one behind the other. The whole presented the appearance of a vast rectangle placed crosswise at the end of another rectangle. Thothmes II and Hatshepsut covered the walls erected by their father with bas-relief sculptures, but added no more buildings. Hatshepsut, however, in order to bring in her obelisks between the pylons of Thothmes I, opened a breach in the south wall, and overthrew 16 of the columns which stood in that spot. Thothmes III, probably finding certain parts of the structure unworthy of the god, rebuilt the first pylon, and also the double sanctuary, which he renewed in the red granite of Syene. To the eastward he rebuilt some old chambers, the most important among them being the processional hall, used for the starting point and halting place of ceremonial processions, and these he surrounded with a stone wall. He also made the lake whereon the sacred boats were launched on festive days, and with a sharp change of axis he built 2 pylons facing towards the south, thus violating the true relative proportion which had till then subsisted between the body and the front of the general mass of the building. The outer enclosure was now too large for the earlier pylons, and did not properly accord with the later ones. Amenhotep III corrected this defect. He erected a 6th and yet more massive pylon, which was, therefore, better suited for the façade. As it now stood, the temple surpassed even the boldest architectural enterprises hitherto attempted. But the pharaohs of the 19th dynasty succeeded in achieving still more. They added only a hypostyle hall and a pylon, but the hypostyle hall measured 170 feet in length by 329 feet in breadth. Down the centre they carried a main avenue of 12 columns with lotus flower capitals, being the loftiest ever erected in the interior of a building, while in the aisles, ranged in 7 rows on either side, they planted 122 columns with lotus bud capitals. The roof of the great nave rose to a height of 75 feet above the level of the ground, and the pylon stood some 50 feet higher still. During a whole century, 3 kings laboured to perfect this hypostyle hall. Rameses I conceived the idea, Seti I finished the bulk of the work, and Rameses II wrought nearly the whole of the decoration. The pharaohs of the next following dynasties vied with each other for such blank spaces as might be found wherein to engrave their names upon the columns, and so to share the glory of the 3 founders. But farther they did not venture. Left thus, however, the monument was still incomplete. It still needed one last pylon and a colonnaded court. Nearly 3 centuries elapsed before the task was again taken in hand. At last the Bubastide kings decided to begin the colonnades, but their work was as feeble as their resources were limited. Taharka, the Ethiopian, imagined for a moment that he was capable of rivalling the great Theban pharaohs, and planned a hypostyle hall even larger than the first. But he made a false start. The columns of the great nave, which were all that he had time to erect, were placed too wide apart to admit of being roofed over, so they never supported anything, but remained as memorials of his failure. Finally, the Ptolemies, faithful to the traditions of the native monarchy, threw themselves into the work, but their labours were interrupted by revolts at Thebes, and the earthquake of the year 27 B.C. destroyed part of the temple, so that the pylon remained for ever unfinished. The history of Karnak is identical with that of all great Egyptian temples. When closely studied, the reason why they are, for the most part, so irregular becomes evident. The general plan is practically the same, and the progress of the building was carried forward in the same way, but the architects could not always foresee the future importance of their work, and the site was not always favourable to the development of the building. At Luxor, the progress went on methodically enough under Amenhotep III and Seti I, but when Rameses II desired to add to the work of his predecessors, a bend in the river compelled him to turn eastwards. His pylon is not parallel to that of Amenhotep III, and his colonnades make a distinct angle with the general axis of the earlier work. At Philae, the deviation is still greater. Not only is the larger pylon out of alignment with the smaller, but the two colonnades are not parallel with each other. Neither are they attached to the pylon with a due regard to symmetry. This arises neither from negligence nor wilfulness, as is popularly supposed. The first plan was as regular as the most symmetrically minded designer could wish, but it became necessary to adapt it to the requirements of the site, and the architects were thenceforth chiefly concerned to make the best of the irregularities to which they were condemned by the configuration of the ground. Such difficulties were, in fact, a frequent source of inspiration, and Philae shows with what skill the Egyptians extracted every element of beauty and picturesqueness from enforced disorder. The idea of the rock-cut temple must have occurred to the Egyptians at an early period. They carved the houses of the dead in the mountainside. Why, therefore, should they not in like manner carve the houses of the gods? Yet the earliest known Speos sanctuaries date from only the beginning of the 18th dynasty. They are generally found in those parts of the valley where the cultivable land is narrowest, as near Beni Hassan, at Gebel Silsila, and in Nubia. All varieties of the constructed temple are found in the rock-cut temple, though more or less modified by local conditions. The Speos Artemidos is approached by a pillared portico, but only contains a square chamber with a niche at the end for the statue of the goddess Pakhet. At Kalalat Adda, a flat, narrow facade faces the river, and is reached by a steep flight of steps. Next comes a hypostyle hall, flanked by two dark chambers, and lastly a sanctuary in 2 stories, one above the other. The chapel of Horemheb at Gebel Silsila is formed of a gallery parallel to the river, supported by 4 massive pillars left in the rock. From this gallery the sanctuary chamber opens at right angles. At Abu Simbel 2 temples are excavated entirely in the cliff. The front of the great Speos imitates a sloping pylon crowned with a cornice, and guarded as usual by 4 seated colossi, flanked by smaller statues. These colossi are 66 feet high. The doorway passed, there comes a first hall measuring 130 feet in length by 60 feet in width, which corresponds to the usual peristyle. 8 Osiride statues, backed by as many square pillars, seem to bear the mountain on their heads. Beyond this come a hypostyle hall, a transverse gallery isolating the sanctuary and the sanctuary itself between 2 smaller chambers. 8 crypts, sunk at somewhat lower level than that of the main excavation, are unequally distributed to the right and left of the peristyle. The whole excavation measures 180 feet from the doorway to the end of the sanctuary. The small Speos of Hathor, about 100 paces to the northward, is of smaller dimensions. The facade is adorned with 6 standing colossi, 4 representing Rameses II and 2 his wife Nefertari. The peristyle and the crypts are lacking, and the small chambers are placed at either end of the transverse passage, instead of being parallel with the sanctuary. The hypostyle hall, however, is supported by 6 Hathor-headed pillars. Where space permitted, the rock-cut temple was but partly excavated in the cliff, the forepart being constructed outside with blocks cut and dressed, and becoming half grotto, half building. In the Hemispeos at Dur, the peristyle is external to the cliff. At Biat el Wali, the pylon and court are built. At Gerf Hesen and Wadi Sabua, pylon, court, and hypostyle hall are all outside the mountain. The most celebrated and original Hemispeos is that built by Queen Hatshepsut at Deir el Bahari in the Theban necropolis. The sanctuary and chapels which, as usual, accompany it, were cut about 100 feet above the level of the valley. In order to arrive at that height, slopes were made and terraces laid out according to a plan which was not understood until the site was thoroughly excavated. Between the Hemispios and the isolated temple, the Egyptians created yet another variety, namely, the built temple backed by, but not carried into, the cliff. The temple of the Sphinx at Gizeh, and the temple of Seti I at Abydos, may be cited as two good examples. I have already described the former. The area of the latter was cleared in a narrow and shallow belt of sand, which here divides the plain from the desert. It was sunk up to the roof, the tops of the walls but just showing above the level of the ground. The staircase which led up to the terraced roof led also to the top of the hill. The front, which stood completely out, seemed in no wise extraordinary. It was approached by two pylons, two courts, and a shallow portico supported on square pillars. The unusual part of the building only began beyond this point. First, there were two hypostyle halls instead of one. These are separated by a wall with 7 doorways. There is no nave, and the sanctuary opens direct from the second hall. This, as usual, consists of an oblong chamber with a door at each end. But the rooms by which it is usually surrounded are here placed side by side in a line, 2 to the right and 4 to the left. Further, they are covered by corbelled vaults, and are lighted only from the doors. Behind the sanctuary are further novelties. Another hypostyle hall abuts on the end wall, and its dependencies are unequally distributed to right and left. As if this were not enough, the architect also constructed to the left of the main building a court, 5 chambers of columns, various passages, and dark chambers. In short, an entire wing branching off at right angles to the axis of the temple proper, with no counterbalancing structures on the other side. These irregularities become intelligible when the site is examined. The cliff is shallow at this part, and the smaller hypostyle hall is backed by only a thin partition of rock. If the usual plan had been followed, it would have been necessary to cut the cliff entirely away, and the structure would have forfeited its special characteristic, that of a temple backed by a cliff, as desired by the founder. The architect therefore distributed in width those proportions of the edifice which he could not carry out in length, and he even threw out a wing. Some years later, when Rameses II constructed a monument to his own memory about 100 yards to the northward of the older building, he was careful not to follow in his father's footsteps. Built on the top of an elevation, his temple had sufficient space for development, and the conventional plan was followed in all its strictness. Most temples, even the smallest, should be surrounded by a square enclosure or temenos. At Medinet Habu, this enclosure wall is of sandstone, low and embattled. This innovation is due to a whim of Rameses III, who, in giving to his monument the outward appearance of a fortress, sought to commemorate his Syrian victories. Elsewhere, the doorways are of stone, and the walls are built in irregular courses of crude bricks. The great enclosure wall was not, as frequently stated, intended to isolate the temple and screen the priestly ceremonies from eyes profane. It marked the limits of the divine dwelling, and served, when needful, to resist the attacks of enemies whose cupidity might be excited by the accumulated riches of the sanctuary. As at Karnak, avenues of sphinxes and series of pylons led up to the various gates, and formed triumphal approaches. The rest of the ground was in part occupied by stables, cellarage, granaries, and private houses. Just as in Europe during the Middle Ages, the population crowded most densely round and about the churches and abbeys, so in Egypt they swarmed around the temples, profiting by that security which the terror of his name and the solidity of his ramparts ensured to the local deity. A clear space was at first reserved round the pylons and the walls, but in course of time the houses encroached upon this ground, and were even built up against the boundary wall. Destroyed and rebuilt, century after century, upon the selfsame spot, the debris of these surrounding dwellings so raised the level of the soil that the temples ended, for the most part, by being gradually buried in a hollow formed by the artificial elevation of the surrounding city. Herodotus noticed this at Bubastis, and on examination it is seen to have been the same in many other localities. At Ombos, at Edfu, at Dendera, the whole city nestled inside the precincts of the divine dwelling. At El Kab, where the temple temenos formed a separate enclosure within the boundary of the city walls, it served as a sort of donjon or keep, in which the garrison could seek a last refuge. At Memphis and at Thebes there were as many keeps as there were great temples, and these sacred fortresses, each at first standing alone in the midst of houses, were from the time of the 18th dynasty connected each with each by avenues of sphinxes. These were commonly androsphinxes, combining the head of a man and the body of a lion. But we also find criosphinxes, which united a ram's head with a lion's body. Elsewhere, in places where the local worship admitted of such substitution, a couchant ram, holding a statuette of the royal founder between his bent forelegs, takes the place of the conventional sphinx. The avenue leading from Luxor to Karnak was composed of these diverse elements. It was 1 mile and a quarter in length, and there were many bends in it. But this fact affords no fresh proof of Egyptian symmetrophobia. The enclosures of the two temples were not oriented alike, and the avenues which started squarely from the fronts of each could never have met had they not deviated from their first course. Finally, it may be said that the inhabitants of Thebes saw about as much of their temples as we see at the present day. The sanctuary and its immediate surroundings were closed against them, but they had access to the facades, the courts, and even the hypostyle halls, and might admire the masterpieces of their architects as freely as we admire them now. End of Chapter 2, Section 2. Recording by Timothy Ferguson, Gold Coast, Australia. Chapter 2, Section 3 of Manual of Egyptian Archaeology and Guide to the Study of Antiquities in Egypt by Gaston Maspero, translated by Amelia B. Edwards. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Timothy Ferguson. Chapter 2, Religious Architecture. Section 3, Decoration. Ancient tradition affirmed that the earliest Egyptian temples contained neither sculptured images, inscriptions, nor symbols, and in point of fact, the Temple of the Sphinx is bare. But this is a unique example. The fragments of architraves and masonry bearing the name of Khafra, which were used for building material in the northern pyramid of Lisht, show that this primitive simplicity had already been abandoned by the time of the 4th dynasty. During the Theban period, all smooth surfaces, all pylons, wall faces, and shafts of columns were covered with figure groups and inscriptions. Under the Ptolemies and the Caesars, figures and hieroglyphs became so crowded that the stone on which they are sculpted seems to be lost under the masses of ornament with which it is charged. We recognise at a glance that these scenes are not placed at random. They follow in sequence, are interlinked, and form, as it were, a great mystic book, in which the official relations between gods and men, as well as between men and gods, are clearly set forth for such as are skilled to read them. The temple was built in the likeness of the world, as the world was known to the Egyptians. The earth, as they believed, was a flat and shallow plain, longer than its width. The sky, according to some, extended overhead like an immense iron ceiling, and according to others, like a huge shallow vault. As it could not remain suspended in space without some support, they imagined it to be held in place by 4 immense props, or pillars. The floor of the temple naturally represented the earth. The columns, and, if needful, the 4 corners of the chambers, stood for the pillars. The roof, vaulted at Abydos, flat elsewhere, corresponded exactly with the Egyptian idea of the sky. Each of these parts was, therefore, decorated in consonance with its meaning. Those next to the ground were clothed with vegetation. The bases of the columns were surrounded by leaves, and the lower parts of the walls were adorned with long stems of lotus or papyrus, in the midst of which animals were occasionally depicted. Bouquets of water plants emerging from the water enlivened the bottom of the wall space in certain chambers. Elsewhere we find full-blown flowers interspersed with buds, or tied together with cords, or those emblematic plants which symbolise the union of Upper and Lower Egypt under the rule of a single pharaoh, or birds with human hands and arms, perched in an attitude of adoration on the sign which represents a solemn festival, or kneeling prisoners tied to the stake in couples, each couple consisting of an Asiatic and a Negro. Male and female Niles, laden with flowers and fruits, either kneel or advance in majestic procession along the ground level. These are the nomes, lakes, and districts of Egypt, bringing offerings of their products to the god. In one instance, at Karnak, Thothmes III caused the fruits, flowers, and animals indigenous to the foreign lands which he had conquered to be sculptured on the lower courses of his walls. The ceilings were painted blue, and sprinkled with 5-pointed stars painted yellow, occasionally interspersed with the cartouches of the royal founder. The monotony of this Egyptian heaven was also relieved by long bands of hieroglyphic inscriptions. The vultures of Nekheb and Uati, the goddesses of the south and north, crowned and armed with divine emblems, hovered above the nave of the hypostyle halls, and on the underside of the lintels of the great doors, above the head of the king as he passed through on his way to the sanctuary. At the Ramesseum, at Edfu, at Philae, at Dendera, at Ombos, at Esneh, the depths of the firmament seemed to open to the eyes of the faithful, revealing the dwellers therein. There the celestial ocean poured forth its floods, navigated by the sun and moon, with their attendant escort of planets, constellations, and decani; and there also the genii of the months and days marched in long procession. In the Ptolemaic age, zodiacs fashioned after Greek models were sculptured side by side with astronomical tables of purely native origin. The decoration of the architraves which supported the massive roofing slabs was entirely independent of that of the ceiling itself. On these were wrought nothing save boldly cut inscriptions, in which the beauty of the temple, the names of the builder kings who erected it, and the glory of the gods to whom it was consecrated are emphatically celebrated. Finally, the decoration of the lowest part of the walls and of the ceiling was restricted to a small number of subjects which were always similar, the most important and varied scenes being suspended, as it were, between earth and heaven, on the sides of the chambers and the pylons. These scenes illustrate the official relations which subsisted between Egypt and the gods. The people had no right of direct intercourse with the deities. They needed a mediator who, partaking of both human and divine nature, was qualified to communicate with both. The king alone, son of the sun, was of sufficiently high descent to contemplate the god in his temple, to serve him, and to speak with him face to face. Sacrifices could be offered only by him, or through him, and in his name. Even the customary offerings to the dead were supposed to pass through his hands, and the family availed themselves of his name in the formula Sutem ta Hotep to forward them to the other world. The king is seen, therefore, in all parts of the temple, standing, seated, kneeling, slaying the victim, presenting the parts, pouring out the wine, the milk, and the oil, and burning the incense. All humankind acts through him, and through him performs its duty towards the gods. When the ceremonies to be performed required the assistance of many persons, then alone did mortal subordinates, consisting as much as possible of his own family, appear by his side. The queen, standing behind him, like Isis behind Osiris, uplifts her hand to protect him, shakes the sistrum, beats the tambourine to dispel evil spirits, or holds the libation vase or bouquet. The eldest son carries the net, or lassoes the bull, and recites the prayer, while his father successively presents to the god each object prescribed by the ritual. A priest may occasionally act as a substitute for the prince, but other men perform only the most menial offices. They are slaughterers or servants, or they bear the boat or canopy of the god. The god, for his part, is not always alone. He has his wife and his son by his side. Next after them, the gods of the neighbouring homes, and, in a general way, all the gods of Egypt. From the moment that the temple is regarded as representing the world, it must, like the world, contain all gods, both great and small. They are most frequently ranged behind the principal god, seated or standing, and with him they share in the homage paid by the king. Sometimes, however, they take an active part in the ceremonies. The spirits of On and Khonu kneel before the sun, and proclaim his praise. Hor, Set, or Thoth conducts Pharaoh into the presence of his father, Amun-Ra, or performs the functions elsewhere assigned to the prince or the priest. They help him to overthrow the victor, or to snare birds for the sacrifice, and in order to wash away his impurities, they pour upon his head the waters of youth and life. The position and functions of these co-operating gods were strictly defined in the theology. The sun, travelling from east to west, divided the universe into two worlds, the world of the north and the world of the south. The temple, like the universe, was double, and an imaginary line passing through the axis of the sanctuary divided it into two temples, the temple of the south on the right hand, and the temple of the north on the left. The gods and their various manifestations were divided between these two temples, according as they belonged to the northern or southern hemisphere. This fiction of duality was carried yet further. Each chamber was divided, in imitation of the temple, into two halves, the right half belonging to the south, and the left half to the north. The royal homage, to be complete, must be rendered in the temples of the south and of the north, and to the gods of the south and of the north, and with the products of the south and of the north. Each sculptured tableau must therefore be repeated at least twice in each temple, on a right wall and on a left wall. Amen, on the right, receives the corn, the wine, the liquids of the south, while on the left he receives the corn, the wine, and the liquids of the north. As with Amen, so with Mort, Khonsu, Mentu, and many other gods. Want of space frequently frustrated the due execution of this scheme, and we often meet with a tableau in which the products of the north and south together are placed before an Amen, who represents both Amen of the south and Amen of the north. These departures from decorative usage are, however, exceptional, and the dual symmetry is always observed where space permits. In Pharaonic times, the tableaux were not overcrowded. The wall surface intended to be covered was marked off below by a line carried just above the ground level decoration, and was bounded above by the usual cornice, or by a frieze. This frieze might be composed of uraei, or of bunches of lotus, or of royal cartouches, supported on either side by divine symbols, or of emblems borrowed from the local cult, by heads of Hathor, for instance, in a temple dedicated to Hathor, or of a horizontal line of dedicatory inscription engraved in large and deeply cut hieroglyphs. The wall space thus framed in contains sometimes a single scene, and sometimes two scenes, one above the other. The wall must be very lofty if this number is exceeded. Figures and inscriptions were widely spaced, and the scenes succeeded one another with scarcely a break. The spectator had to discover for himself where they began or ended. The head of the king was always studied from the life, and the faces of the gods reproduced the royal portrait as closely as possible. As Pharaoh was the son of the gods, the surest way to obtain portraits of the gods was to model their faces after the face of the king. The secondary figures were no less carefully wrought, but when these were very numerous, they were arranged on 2 or 3 levels, the total height of which never exceeded that of the principal personages. The offerings, the sceptres, the jewels, the vestments, the headdresses, and all the accessories were treated with a genuine feeling for elegance and truth. The colours, moreover, were so combined as to produce in each tableau the effect of one general and prevailing tone, so that in many temples there were chambers which can be justly distinguished as the Blue Hall, the Red Hall, or the Golden Hall. So much for the classical period of decoration. As we come down to later times, these tableaux are multiplied, and under the Greeks and Romans they become so numerous that the smallest wall contained not less than 4, 5, 6, or even 8 registers. The principal figures are, as it were, compressed, so as to occupy less room, and all the intermediate space is crowded with thousands of tiny hieroglyphs. The gods and kings are no longer portraits of the reigning sovereign, but mere conventional types, without vigour or life. As for the secondary figures and accessories, the sculptor's only care is to crowd in as many as possible. This was not due to a defect of taste, but to the prevalence of a religious idea, which decided but enforced these changes. The object of decoration was not merely the delight of the eye. Applied to a piece of furniture, a coffin, a house, a temple, decoration possessed a certain magic property, of which the power and nature were determined by each being or action represented, by each word inscribed or spoken, at the moment of consecration. Every subject was, therefore, an amulet as well as an ornament. So long as it endured, it ensured to the god the continuance of homage rendered, or sacrifices offered by the king. To the king, whether living or dead, it confirmed the favours granted to him by the god in recompense for his piety. It also preserved from destruction the very wall upon which it was depicted. At the time of the 18th dynasty, it was thought that 2 or 3 such amulets sufficed to compass the desired effect; but at a later period it was believed that their number could not be too freely multiplied, and the walls were covered with as many as the surface would contain. An average number at Edfu or Dendera yields more material for study than the hypostyle hall at Karnak, and the chapel of Antonius Pius at Philae, had it been finished, would have contained more scenes than the sanctuary of Luxor and the passages by which it is surrounded. Observing the variety of subjects treated on the walls of any one temple, one might at first be tempted to think that the decoration does not form a connected whole, and that although many series of scenes must undoubtedly contain the development of an historic idea or a religious dogma, yet the others are merely strung together without any necessary link. At Luxor, and again at the Ramesseum, each face of the pylon is a battlefield, on which may be studied, almost day for day, the campaign of Rameses II against the Kheta, which took place in the 5th year of his reign. There we see the Egyptian camp attacked by night, the king's bodyguards surprised during the march, the defeat of the enemy, their flight, the garrison of Kadesh sallying forth to the relief of the vanquished, and the disasters which befell the prince of the Kheta and his generals. Elsewhere it is not the war which is represented, but the human sacrifices which anciently celebrated the close of each campaign. The king is seen in the act of seizing his prostrate prisoners by the hair of their heads, and uplifting his mace, as if about to shatter their heads at a single blow. At Karnak, along the whole length of the outer wall, Seti I pursues the Bedouin of Sinai. At Medinet Habu, Rameses III destroys the fleet of the peoples of the Great Sea, or receives the cut-off hands of the Libyans, which his soldiers bring to him as trophies. In the next scene all is peace, and we behold Pharaoh pouring out a libation of perfumed water to his father Amen. It would seem as if no link could be established between these subjects, and yet the one is the necessary consequence of the others. If the god had not granted victory to the king in his turn would not have performed these ceremonies in the temple. The sculptor has recorded the events in their order: first the victory, then the sacrifice. The favour of the god precedes the thank-offering of the king. Thus, on closer examination, we find this multitude of episodes forming the several links of one continuous chain, while every scene, including such as seem at first sight to be wholly unexplained, represents one stage in the development of a single action which begins at the door, is carried through the various halls, and penetrates to the farthest recesses of the sanctuary. The king enters the temple. In the courts he is everywhere confronted by reminiscences of his victories, and here the god comes forth to greet him, hidden in his shrine and surrounded by priests. The rites prescribed for these occasions are graven on the walls of the hypostyle hall in which they are performed. These being over, the king and god together take their way to the sanctuary. At the door which leads from the public hall to the mysterious part of the temple, the escort halts. The king crosses the threshold alone, and is welcomed by the gods. He then performs in due order all the sacred ceremonies enjoined by usage. His merits increase by virtue of his prayers, his senses become exalted, he rises to the level of the divine type. Finally he enters the sanctuary, where the god reveals himself unwitnessed, and speaks to him face to face. The sculptures faithfully reproduce the order of this mystic presentation: the welcoming reception on the part of the god, the acts and offerings of the king, the vestments which he puts on and off in succession, the various crowns which he places on his head. The prayers which he recites, and the favours which are conferred upon him, are also recorded upon the walls in order of time and place. The king and the few who accompany him have their backs towards the entrance, and their faces towards the door of the sanctuary. The gods, on the contrary, or at least such as do not make part of the procession, face the entrance, and have their backs turned towards the sanctuary. If during the ceremony the royal memory failed, the king needed but to raise his eyes to the wall. whereon his duties were mapped out for him. Nor was this all. Each part of the temple had its accessory decoration and its furniture. The outer faces of the pylons were ornamented not only with the masts and streamers before mentioned, but with statues and obelisks. The statues, 4 or 6 in number, were of limestone, granite, or sandstone. They invariably represented the royal founder, and were sometimes of prodigious size. The 2 Memnons, seated at the entrance of the temple of Amenhotep III at Thebes, measured about 50 feet in height. The colossal Rameses II of the Ramesseum measured 57 feet, and that of Tanis at least 70 feet. The greater number, however, did not exceed 20 feet. They mounted guard before the temple, facing outwards, as if confronting an approaching enemy. The obelisks of Karnak are mostly hidden amid the central courts, and those of Queen Hatshepsut were embedded for 17 feet of their height in masses of masonry, which concealed their bases. These are accidental circumstances, and easy of explanation. Each of the pylons before which they are stationed had in its turn been the entrance to the temple, and was thrown into the rear by the works of succeeding pharaohs. The true place of all obelisks was at the front of the colossi, on each side of the main entrance. They are always in pairs, but often of unequal height. Some have professed to see in them the emblem of Amen the generator, or a finger of the god, or a ray of the sun. In sober truth, they are a more shapely form of the standing stone, or menhir, which is raised by semi-civilized people in commemoration of their gods or their dead. Small obelisks, about 3 feet in height, are found in tombs as early as the 4th dynasty. They are placed to the right and left of the stela, that is to say, on either side of the door which leads to the dwelling of the dead. Erected before the pylon gates of temples, they are made of granite, and their dimensions are considerable. The obelisk of Heliopolis measures 68 feet in the shaft, and the obelisks of Luxor stand 77 feet and 75½ feet high, respectively. The loftiest known is the obelisk of Queen Hatshepsut at Karnak, which rises to a height of 109 feet. To convey such masses and to place them in equilibrium was a sufficiently difficult task, and one is at a loss to understand how the Egyptians succeeded in erecting them with no other appliances than ropes and sacks of sand. Queen Hatshepsut boasts that her obelisks were quarried, shaped, transported, and erected in 7 months, and we have no reason to doubt the truth of her statement. Obelisks were almost always square, with the faces slightly convex, and a slight slope from top to bottom. The pedestal was formed of a single square block, adorned with inscriptions, or with cynocephali in high relief, adoring the sun. The point was cut as a pyramidion, and sometimes covered with bronze or gilt copper. Scenes of offering to Ra Hamaklis, Hor, Tum, or Amen are engraved on the sides of the pyramidion and on the upper part of the prism. The 4 upright faces are generally decorated with only vertical lines of inscription in praise of the king. Such is the usual type of obelisk, but we here and there meet with exceptions. That of Begig, in Fayum, is in shape a rectangular oblong with a blunt top. A groove upon it shows that it was surmounted by some emblem in metal, perhaps a hawk, like the obelisk represented on a funerary stela in the Gizeh Museum. This form, which, like the first, is a survival of the menhir, was in vogue till the last days of Egyptian art. It is even found in Aksum, in the middle of Ethiopia, dating from about the 4th century of our era, at a time when in Egypt the ancient obelisks were being carried out of the country, and none dreamed of erecting new ones. Such was the accessory decoration of the pylon. The inner courts and hypostyle halls of the temple contained more colossi. Some, placed with their backs against the outer sides of pillars or walls, were half engaged in the masonry, and built up in courses. At Luxor, under the peristyle, and at Karnak, between each column of the great nave, were also placed statues of Pharaoh, but these were statues of Pharaoh the victor, clad in his robe of state. The right of consecrating a statue in the temple was above all a royal prerogative, yet the king sometimes permitted private persons to dedicate their statues by the side of his own. This was, however, a special favour, and such monuments always bear an inscription stating that it is by the king's grace that they occupy that position. Rarely as this privilege was granted, it resulted in a vast accumulation of votive statues, so that in the course of centuries the courts of some temples became crowded with them. At Karnak, the sanctuary enclosure was furnished outside with a kind of broad bench, breast high, like a long base. Upon this the statues were placed, with their backs to the wall. Attached to each was an oblong block of stone, with a projecting spout on one side. These are known as tables of offerings. The upper face is more or less hollowed, and is often sculptured with bas-relief representations of loaves, joints of beef, libation vases, and other objects usually presented to the dead or to the gods. Those of King Ameni-Entef Amenemhat at Gizeh are blocks of red granite more than 3 feet in length, the top of which is hollowed out in regular rows of cup holes, each cup hole being reserved for one particular offering. There was, in fact, an established form of worship provided for statues, and these tables were really altars upon which were deposited sacrificial offerings of meat, cakes, fruits, vegetables, and the like. The sanctuary and the surrounding chambers contained the objects used in the ceremonial of worship. The bases of altars varied in shape, some being square and massive, others polygonal or cylindrical. Some of these last are, in form, not unlike a small cannon, which is the name given to them by the Arabs. The most ancient are those of the 5th dynasty. The most beautiful is one dedicated to Seti I, now in the Gizeh Museum. The only perfect specimen of an altar known to me was discovered at Menshaya in 1884. It is of white limestone, hard and polished like marble. It stands upon a pedestal in the form of a long cone, having no other ornament than a torus about ½ inch below the top. Upon this pedestal, in a hollow specially prepared for its reception, stands a large hemispherical basin. The shrines are little chapels of wood or stone, in which the spirit of the deity was supposed at all times to dwell, and which on ceremonial occasions contained his image. The sacred barks were built after the model of the Bari, or boat, in which the sun performed his daily course. The shrine was placed amidship of the boat, and covered with a veil or curtain to conceal its contents from all spectators. The crew were also represented, each god being at his post of duty, the pilot at the helm, and the lookout at the prow, the king upon his knees before the door of the shrine. We have not yet discovered any of the statues employed in the ceremonial, but we know what they were like, what part they played, and of what materials they were made. They were animated, and in addition to their bodies of stone, metal, or wood, they had each a soul, magically derived from the soul of the divinity which they represented. They spoke, moved, acted, not metaphorically, but actually. The later Ramessides ventured upon no enterprises without consulting them. They stated their difficulties, and the god replied to each question by a movement of the head. According to the Stela at Bakhtan, a statue of Khonsû places its hands 4 times on the nape of the neck of another statue, so transmitting the power of expelling demons. It was after a conversation with the statue of Amen in the dusk of the sanctuary that Queen Hatshepsut dispatched her squadron to the shores of the Land of Incense. Theoretically, the divine soul of the image was understood to be the only miracle worker. Practically, its speech and motions were the result of a pious fraud. Interminable avenues of sphinxes, gigantic obelisks, massive pylons, halls of 100 columns, mysterious chambers of perpetual night. In a word, the whole Egyptian temple and its dependencies were built by way of a hiding place for a performing puppet, of which the wires were worked by a priest. End of Chapter 2, Section 3. Recording by Timothy Ferguson, Gold Coast, Australia. Chapter 3, Section 1 of Manual of Egyptian Archaeology and Guide to the Study of Antiquities in Egypt by Gaston Maspero. Translated by Amelia B. Edwards. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Timothy Ferguson. Chapter 3, Tombs. Section 1, Mastabas. The Egyptians regarded man as composed of various different entities, each having its separate life and functions. First there was the body, then the ka, or double, which was a less solid duplicate of the corporeal form, a coloured but ethereal projection of the individual, reproducing him feature for feature. The double of a child was as a child, the double of a woman was as a woman, the double of a man was as a man. After the double, ka, came the soul, bai or ba, which was popularly represented as a human-headed bird. After the soul came the khu, or the luminous, a spark from the divine fire. None of these elements were in their own natures imperishable. Left to themselves, they would hasten to dissolution, and the man would thus die a second time, that is to say, he would be annihilated. The piety of the survivors found means, however, to avert this catastrophe. By the process of embalmment, they could for ages suspend the decomposition of the body, while by means of prayer and offerings they saved the double, the soul, and the luminous from the second death, and secured to them all that was necessary for the prolongation of their existence. The double never left the place where the mummy reposed, but the soul and the khu went forth to follow the gods. They, however, kept perpetually returning, like travellers who come home after an absence. The tomb was, therefore, a dwelling house, the eternal house of the dead, compared with which the houses of the living were but wayside inns, and these eternal houses were built after a plan which exactly corresponded to the Egyptian idea of the afterlife. The eternal house must always include the private rooms of the soul, which were closed on the day of the burial, and which no living being could enter without being guilty of sacrilege. It must also contain the reception rooms of the double, where priests and friends brought their wishes or their offerings, the two being connected by a passage of more or less length. The arrangement of these three parts varied according to the period, the place, the nature of the ground, and the caprice of each person. The rooms accessible to the living were frequently built above ground, and formed a separate edifice. Sometimes they were excavated in the mountain side, as well as the tomb itself. Sometimes, again, the vault where the mummy lay hidden, and the passages leading to that vault, were in one place, while the place of prayer and offering stood far off in the plain. But whatever variety there may be found as to detail and arrangement, the principle is always the same. The tomb is a dwelling, and it is constructed in such wise as may best promote the well-being and ensure the preservation of the dead. 1. Mastabas. The most ancient monumental tombs are found in the necropolis of Memphis, between Abu Roash and Dashur, and in that of Medum. They belong to the mastaba type. The mastaba is a quadrangular building, which from a distance might be taken for a truncated pyramid. Many mastabas are from 30 to 40 feet in height, 150 feet in length, and 80 feet in width, while others do not exceed 10 feet in height or 15 feet in length. The faces are symmetrically inclined, and generally smooth, though sometimes the courses retreat like steps. The materials employed are stone or brick. The stone is limestone cut in blocks about 2.5 feet long, 2 feet high, and 20 inches thick. 3 sorts of limestone were employed. For the best tombs, the fine white limestone of Tura, or the compact siliceous limestone of Saqqara. For ordinary tombs, the Mali limestone of the Libyan hills. This last, impregnated with salt and veined with crystalline gypsum, is a friable material and unsuited for ornamentation. The bricks are of two kinds, both being merely sun-dried. The most ancient kind, which ceased to be used about the time of the 6th dynasty, is small, 8.7 by 4.3 by 5.5 inches, yellowish, and made of nothing but sand, mixed with a little clay and grit. The later kind is of mud mixed with straw, black, compact, carefully moulded, and of a fair size, 15 by 7.1 by 5.5 inches. The style of the internal construction differs according to the material employed by the architect. In 9 cases out of 10, the stone mastabas are but outwardly regular in construction. The core is of roughly quarried marble, mixed with rubbish, and limestone fragments hastily bedded in layers of mud, or piled up without any kind of mortar. The brick mastabas are nearly always of homogeneous construction. The facing bricks are carefully mortared, and the joints inside are filled up with sand. That the mastaba should be canonically oriented, the 4 faces set to the 4 cardinal points, and the longer access laid from north to south was indispensable. But practically the masons took no special care about finding the true north, and the orientation of these structures is seldom exact. At Gizeh, the mastabas are distributed according to a symmetrical plan and ranged in regular streets. At Saqqara, at Abu Sir, and at Dahshur, they are scattered irregularly over the surface of the plateau, crowded in some places and wide apart in others. The Mussulman cemetery at Siut perpetuates the like arrangement, and enables us to this day to realise the aspect of the Memphite necropolis towards the close of the ancient empire. A flat, unpaved platform, formed by the top course of the core, covers the top of the mass of the mastaba. This platform is scattered over with terracotta vases, nearly buried in the loose rubbish. These lie thickly over the hollow interior, but are more sparsely deposited elsewhere. The walls are bare. The doors face to the eastward side. They occasionally face toward the north or south side, but never towards the west. In theory, there should be two doors, one for the dead, the other for the living. In practice, the entrance for the dead was a mere niche, high and narrow, cut in the eastward face, near the northeast corner. At the back of this niche are marked vertical lines, framing in a closed space. Even this imitation of a door was sometimes omitted, and the soul was left to manage as best it might. The door of the living was made more or less important according to the greater or less development of the chamber to which it led. The chamber and door are in some cases represented by only a shallow recess, decorated with a stela and a table of offerings. This is sometimes protected by a wall, which projects from the façade, thus forming a kind of forecourt open to the north. The forecourt is square in the tomb of Capia, and irregular in that of Neferhotep at Saqqara. When the plan includes one or more chambers, the door sometimes opens in the middle of a small architectural façade, or under a little portico, supported by two square pillars without either base or abacus. The doorway is very simple, the two jambs being ornamented with bas-reliefs representing the deceased, and surmounted by a cylindrical drum engraved with his name and titles. In the tomb of Pohanaka at Saqqara, the jambs are two pilasters, each crowned with two lotus flowers. But this example is, so far, unique. The chapel was usually small, and lost in the mass of the building, but no precise rule determined its size. In the tomb of Ti, there is, first, a portico, then a square antechamber with pillars, then a passage with a small room on the right, leading to the last chamber. There was room enough in this tomb for many persons, and, in point of fact, the wife of Ti reposed by the side of her husband. When the monument belonged to only one person, the structure was less complicated. A short and narrow passage led to an oblong chamber, upon which it opened at right angles, so that the place is in the shape of a T. The end wall is generally smooth, but sometimes it is recessed just opposite the entrance passage, and then the plan forms a cross, of which the head is longer or shorter. This was the ordinary arrangement, but the architect was free to reject it if he so pleased. Here a chapel consists of two parallel lobbies connected by a cross passage. Elsewhere the chamber opens from a corner of the passage. Again, in the tomb of Ptahhotep, the site was hemmed in by older buildings and was not large enough. The builders therefore joined the new mastaba to the older one in such wise as to give them one entrance in common, and thus the chapel of one is enlarged by absorbing the whole of the space occupied by the other. The chapel was the reception room of the double. It was there that the relations, friends, and priests celebrated the funerary sacrifices on the days prescribed by law, that is to say, quote, at the feasts of the commencement of the seasons, at the feast of Thoth on the first day of the year, at the feast of Igaya, at the feast of Sothis, on the day of the procession of the god Min, at the feast of Shewbread, at the feasts of the months and the half-months, and the days of the week. End quote. Offerings were placed in the principal room, at the foot of the west wall, at the exact spot leading to the entrance of the eternal home of the dead. Unlike the Qibla of mosques or Mussulman oratories, this point is not always oriented toward the same quarter of the compass, though often found to the west. In earlier times it was indicated by a real door, low and narrow, framed and decorated like the door of an ordinary house, but not pierced through. An inscription graven upon the lintel in large readable characters commemorated the name and rank of the owner. His portrait, either sitting or standing, was carved upon the jambs, and a scene sculptured or painted on the space above the door represented him seated before a small round table, stretching out his hand towards the repast placed upon it. A flat slab, or offering table, built into the floor between the two uprights of the doorway, received the votive meats and drinks. The general appearance of the recess is that of a somewhat narrow doorway. As a rule it was empty, but occasionally it contained a portrait statue of the dead, standing with one foot forward, as though about to cross the gloomy threshold of his tomb, descend the few steps before him, advance into his reception room or chapel, and pass out into the sunlight. As a matter of fact, the stela symbolised the door leading to the private apartments of the dead, a door closed and sealed to the living. It was inscribed on doorposts and lintels, and its inscription was no mere epitaph for the information of future generations. All the details which it gave as to the name, rank, functions, and family of the deceased were intended to secure the continuity of his individuality and civil status in the life beyond death. A further and essential object of its inscriptions was to provide him with food and drink by means of prayers or magic formulae, constraining one of the gods of the dead, Osiris or Anubis, to act as intermediary between him and his survivors, and to set apart for his use some portion of the provisions offered for his sake in sacrifice to one or other of these deities. By this agency, the cars or doubles of these provisions were supposed to be sent into the next world to gladden and satisfy the human car indicated to the divine intermediary. Offerings of real provisions were not indispensable to this end. Any chance visitor, in times to come, who should simply repeat the formula of the stela aloud, would thereby secure the immediate enjoyment of all the good things enumerated to the unknown dead whom he evoked. The living having taken their departure, the double was supposed to come out of his house and feed. In principle, this ceremony was bound to be renewed year by year till the end of time, but the Egyptians ere long discovered that this could not be. After 2 or 3 generations, the dead of former days were neglected for the benefit of those more recently departed. Even when a pious foundation was established, with a revenue payable for the expenses of the funerary repasts and of the priests whose duty it was to prepare them, the evil hour of oblivion was put off for only a little longer. Sooner or later there came a time when the double was reduced to seek his food among the town refuse, and amid the ignoble and corrupt filth which lay rejected on the ground. Then, in order that the offerings consecrated on the day of burial might for ever preserve their virtues, the survivors conceived the idea of drawing and describing them on the walls of the chapel. The painted or sculptured reproduction of persons and things ensured the reality of those persons and things for the benefit of the one on whose account they were executed. Thus the double saw himself depicted upon the walls in the act of eating and drinking, and he ate and drank. This notion once accepted, the theologians and artists carried it out to the fullest extent. Not content with offering mere pictured provisions, they added thereto the semblance of the domains which produced them, together with the counterfeit presentment of the herds, workmen, and slaves belonging to the same. Was a supply of meat required to last for eternity? It was enough, no doubt, to represent the several parts of an ox or gazelle, the shoulder, the leg, the ribs, the breast, the heart, the liver, the head, properly prepared for the spit. But it was equally easy to retrace the whole history of the animal, its birth, its life in the pasture lands, its slaughter, the cutting up of the carcass, and the presentation of the joints. So also as regarded the cakes and bread offerings. There was no reason why the whole process of tillage, harvesting, corn threshing, storage, and dough kneading should not be rehearsed. Clothing, ornaments, and furniture served in like manner as a pretext for the introduction of spinners, weavers, goldsmiths, and cabinet makers. The master is of superhuman proportions, and towers above his people and his cattle. Some prophetic tableaux show him in his funeral bark, speeding before the wind with all sail set, having started on his way to the next world the very day he takes possession of his new abode. Elsewhere we see him as actively superintending his imaginary vassals, as formerly he superintended his vassals of flesh and blood. Varied and irregular as they may appear, these scenes are not placed at random upon the walls. They all converge towards the semblance of a door, which was supposed to communicate with the interior of the tomb. Those nearest to the door represent the sacrifice and the offering, the earlier stages of preparation, and the preliminary work being depicted in retrograde order as that door is left farther and farther behind. At the door itself, the figure of the master seems to await his visitors and bid them welcome. The details are of infinite variety. The inscriptions run to less or greater length according to the caprice of the scribe. The false door loses its architectural character and is frequently replaced by a mere stela engraved with the name and rank of the master. Yet, whether large or small, whether richly decorated or not decorated at all, the chapel is always the dining room, or rather the larder, to which the dead man has access when he feels hungry. On the other side of the wall was constructed a hiding place in the form of either a high and narrow cell, or a passage without outlet. To this hiding place archaeologists have given the Arab name of serdab. Most mastabas contain but one, others contain 3 or 4. These serdabs communicated neither with each other nor with the chapel, and are, as it were, buried in the masonry. If connected at all with the outer world, it is by means of an aperture in the wall about as high up as a man's head, and so small that the hand can with difficulty pass through it. To this orifice came the priests with murmured prayers and perfumes of incense. Within lurked the double, ready to profit by these memorial rites, or to accept them through the medium of his statues. As when he lived upon the earth, the man needed a body in which to exist. His corpse, disfigured by the process of embalmment, bore but a distant resemblance to his former self. The mummy again was destructible, and might easily be burned, dismembered, scattered to the winds. Once it had disappeared, what was to become of the double? The portrait statues walled up inside the serdab became, when consecrated, the stone or wooden bodies of the defunct. The pious care of his relatives multiplied these bodies, and consequently multiplied the supports of the double. A single body represented a single chance of existence for the double. 20 bodies represented 20 such chances. For the same reason, statues also of his wife, his children, and his servants were placed with the statues of the deceased, the servants being modelled in the act of performing their domestic duties, such as grinding corn, kneading dough, and applying a coat of pitch to the inside surfaces of wine jars. As for the figures, which were merely painted on the walls of the chapel, they detached themselves and assumed material bodies inside the serdab. Notwithstanding these precautions, all possible means were taken to guard the remains of the fleshy body from natural decay and the depredations of the spoiler. In the tomb of Ti, an inclined passage, starting from the middle of the first hall, leads from the upper world to the sepulchral vault, but this is almost a solitary exception. Generally, the vault is reached by way of a vertical shaft constructed in the centre of the platform, or, more rarely, in a corner of the chapel. The depth of this shaft varies from 10 to 100 feet. It is carried down through the masonry, it pierces the rock, and at the bottom a low passage, in which it is not possible to walk upright, leads in a southward direction to the vault. There sleeps the mummy in a massive sarcophagus of limestone, red granite, or basalt. Sometimes, though rarely, the sarcophagus bears the name and titles of the deceased. Still more rarely, it is decorated with ornamental sculpture. Some examples are known which reproduce the architectural decoration of an Egyptian house, with its doors and windows. The furniture of the vault is of the simplest character. Some alabaster perfume vases, a few cups into which the priest had poured drops of the various libation liquids offered to the dead, some large red pottery jars for water, a headrest of wood or alabaster, a scribe's votive pallet. Having laid the mummy in the sarcophagus and cemented the lid, the workmen strewed the floor of the vault with the quarters of oxen and gazelles which had just been sacrificed. They next carefully walled up the entrance into the passage, and filled the shaft at the top with a mixture of sand, earth, and stone chips. Being profusely watered, this mass solidified and became an almost impenetrable body of concrete. The corpse, left to itself, received no visits now, save from the soul, which from time to time quitted the celestial regions wherein it voyaged with the gods, and came down to reunite itself with the body. The sepulchral vault was the abode of the soul, as the funerary chapel was the abode of the double. Up to the time of the Sixth Dynasty, the walls of the vault are left bare. Only once did Mariette find a vault containing half-effaced inscriptions from the Book of the Dead. In 1881, however, I discovered some tombs at Saqqara in which the vault is decorated in preference to the chapel. These tombs are built with large bricks, a niche and a stela sufficing for the reception of sacrificial offerings. In place of the shaft, they contain a small rectangular court, in the western corner of which is placed the sarcophagus. Over the sarcophagus was erected a limestone chamber, just as long and as wide as the sarcophagus itself, and about 3½ feet high. This was roofed in flat slabs. At the end, or in the wall to the right, was a niche, which answered the purpose of a serdab; and above the flat roof was next constructed an arch of about 1½ foot radius, the space above the arch being filled in with horizontal courses of brickwork up to the level of the platform. The chamber occupies about 2/3 of the cavity, and looks like an oven with the mouth open. Sometimes the stone walls rest on the lid of the sarcophagus, the chamber having evidently been built after the interment had taken place. Generally speaking, however, these walls rest on brick supports, so that the sarcophagus may be opened or closed when required. The decoration, which is sometimes painted, sometimes sculptured, is always the same. Each wall was a house stocked with the objects depicted or catalogued upon its surface, and each was, therefore, carefully provided with a fictitious door, through which the double had access to his goods. On the left wall he found a pile of provisions and a table of offerings. On the end wall, a store of household utensils, as well as a supply of linen and perfumes, the name and quantity of each being duly registered. These paintings, more briefly, sum up the scenes depicted in the chapels of ordinary mastabas. Transferred from their original position to the walls of an underground cellar, they were the more surely guaranteed against such possible destruction as might befall them in chambers open to all comers; while upon their preservation depended the length of time during which the dead man would retain possession of the property which they represented. End of Chapter 3, Section 1. Recording by Timothy Ferguson, Gold Coast, Australia. Chapter 3, Section 2 of Manual of Egyptian Archaeology and Guide to the Study of Antiquities in Egypt by Gaston Maspero, translated by Amelia B. Edwards. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Timothy Ferguson. Chapter 3, Section 2, The Pyramids. Bracketed note. For the following translation of this section of Professor Maspero's book, I am indebted to the kindness of Mr. W. M. Flinders Petrie, whose work on The Pyramids and Temples of Giza, published with the assistance of a grant from the Royal Society in 1883, constitutes our standard authority on the construction of these pyramids. A. B. E. End of bracketed note. The royal tombs have the form of pyramids with a square base, and are the equivalent in stone or brick of the tumulus of heaped earth which was piled over the body of a warrior chief in prehistoric times. The same ideas prevailed as to the souls of kings as about those of private men. The plan of the pyramid consists therefore of 3 parts, like the mastaba: the chapel, the passage, and the sepulchral vault. The chapel is always separate. At Saqqara no trace of it has been found. It was probably, as later on at Thebes, in a quarter nearer to the town. At Medum, Giza, Abusir, and Dahshur, these temples stood at the east or north fronts of the pyramids. They were true temples with chambers, courts, and passages. The fragments of bas-reliefs hitherto found show scenes of sacrifice, and prove that the decoration was the same as in the public halls of the mastabas. The pyramid, properly speaking, contained only the passages and sepulchral vault, the oldest of which the texts show the existence, north of Abydos, is that of Sneferu, the latest belonging to the princes of the 12th dynasty. The construction of these monuments was, therefore, a continuous work, lasting for 13 or 14 centuries under government direction. Granite, alabaster, and basalt for the sarcophagus, and some details, were the only materials of which the use and quantity was not regulated in advance, and which had to be bought from a distance. To obtain them, each king sent out one of the great men of his court on a mission to the quarries of Upper Egypt, and the quickness with which the blocks were brought back was a strong claim upon the sovereign's favour. The other material was not so costly. If mainly brick, the bricks were moulded on the spot with earth taken from the foot of the hill. If of stone, the nearest parts of the plateau provided the common Mali limestone in abundance. The fine limestone of Tura was usually reserved for the chambers and the casing, and this might be had without even sending specially for it to the opposite side of the Nile, for at Memphis there were stores always full, upon which they continually drew for public buildings, and therefore also for the royal tombs. The blocks being taken from these stores, and borne by boats to close below the hill, were raised to their required places along gently sloping causeways. The internal arrangement of the pyramids, the lengths of the passages, and their heights, were very variable. The pyramid of Khufu (Cheops) rose to 475 feet above the ground. The smallest was not 30 feet high. The difficulty of imagining now what motives determined the Pharaohs to choose such different proportions has led some to think that the mass built was in direct proportion to the time occupied in building, that is to say, to the length of each reign. Thus it was supposed that the king would begin by hastily erecting a pyramid large enough to contain the essential parts of a tomb, and then year by year would add fresh layers around the first core, until the time when his death for ever arrested the growth of the monument. But the facts do not justify this hypothesis. The smallest of the pyramids of Saqqara is that of Unas, who reigned 30 years, while the two imposing pyramids of Gizeh were raised by Khufu and Khafra (Chephren), who governed Egypt, the one for 24 and the other for 23 years. Merenra, who died very young, had a pyramid as large as that of Pepi II, whose reign lasted more than 90 years. The plan of each pyramid was laid down once and for all by the architect according to the instructions which he had received and the resources placed at his disposal. He then followed it out to the end of the work without increasing or reducing the scale. The pyramids were supposed to have their four faces to the four cardinal points, like the mastabas, but either from bad management or neglect, the greater part are not oriented exactly, and many vary distinctly from the true north. Without speaking of the ruins of Abu Roash or Zoat el Aryan, which have not been studied closely enough, they naturally form 6 groups distributed from north to south on the border of the Libyan plateau, from Gizeh to the Fayum, by Abu Sur, Saqqara, Dashur, and Lisht. The Gizeh group contains 9, including those of Khufu, Khafra, and Menkaura, which were anciently reckoned among the wonders of the world. The ground on which the pyramid of Khufu stands was very irregular at the time of construction. A small rocky height which rose above the surface was roughly cut and enclosed in masonry, the rest being smoothed and covered with large slabs, some of which still remain. The pyramid itself was 481 feet high and 755 feet wide, dimensions which the injuries of time have reduced to 454 feet and 750 feet respectively. It preserved, until the Arab conquest, a casing of stones of different colours, so skilfully joined as to appear like one block from base to summit. The casing work was begun from the top, and the cap placed on first, the steps being covered one after the other until they reached the bottom. In the inside, all was arranged so as to hide the exact place of the sarcophagus, and to baffle any spoilers whom chance or perseverance had led aright. The first point was to discover the entrance under the casing which masked it. It was nearly in the middle of the north face, but at the level of the 18th course, at about 45 feet from the ground. When the block which closed it was displaced, an inclined passage, 41.2 inches wide and 47.6 inches high, was revealed, the lower part of which was cut in the rock. This descended for 317 feet, passed through an unfinished chamber, and entered 60 feet farther in a blind passage. This would be a first disappointment to the spoilers. If, however, they were not discouraged, but examined the passage with care, they would find in the roof, 62 feet distant from the door, a block of granite among the surrounding limestone. It was so hard that the seekers, having vainly tried to break or remove it, took the course of forcing a way through the softer stone around. This obstacle passed, they came into an ascending passage which joins the first at an angle of 120 degrees, and is divided into 2 branches. One branch runs horizontally into the centre of the pyramid, and ends in a limestone chamber with pointed roof, which is called without any good reason the Queen's Chamber. The other, continuing upward, changes its form and appearance. It becomes a gallery 148 feet long and 28 feet high, built of Mokattam stone, so polished and finely wrought that it is difficult to put a "needle or even a hair" into the joints. The lower courses are vertical, the 7 others "corbel" forwards, until at the roof they are only 21 inches apart. A fresh obstacle arose at the end of this gallery. The passage which led to the chamber of the sarcophagus was closed by a slab of granite. Farther on was a small vestibule, divided in equal spaces by 4 portcullises of granite, which would need to be broken. The royal sepulchre is a granite chamber with a flat roof, 19 feet high, 34 feet long, and 17 feet wide. Here are neither figures nor inscriptions, nothing but a granite sarcophagus, lidless and mutilated. Such were the precautions taken against invaders, and the result showed that they were effectual, for the pyramid guarded its deposit during more than 4,000 years. But the very weight of the materials was a more serious danger. To prevent the sepulchral chamber from being crushed by the 300 feet of stone which stood over it, 5 low hollow spaces, one over the other, were left above it. The last is sheltered by a pointed roof, formed by 2 enormous slabs, leaning one against the other. Thanks to this device, the central pressure was thrown almost entirely on the side faces, and the chamber was preserved. None of the stones which cover it have been crushed. None have yielded a fraction since the day when the workmen cemented them into their places. The pyramids of Khafra and Menkaura were built on a different plan inside to that of Khufu. Khafra's had 2 entrances, both to the north, one from the platform before the pyramid, the other 50 feet above the ground. Menkaura's still preserves the remains of its casing of red granite. The entrance passage descends at an angle of 26 degrees and soon runs into the rock. The first chamber is decorated with panels sculptured in the stone, which was closed at the further end by 3 portcullises of granite. The second chamber appears to be unfinished, but this was a trap to deceive the spoilers. A passage cut in the floor and carefully hidden gave access to a lower chamber. There lay the mummy in a sarcophagus of sculptured basalt. The sarcophagus was still perfect at the beginning of this century. Removed thence by Colonel Howard Vyse, it foundered on the Spanish coast with the ship which was bearing it to England. The same variety of arrangement prevails in the groups of Abu Sir and in one part of the Saqqara group. The Great Pyramid of Saqqara is not oriented with exactness. The north face is turned 4 degrees 21 minutes east of the true north. It is not a perfect square, but is elongated from east to west, the sides being 395 and 351 feet. It is 196 feet high, and is formed of 6 great steps with inclined faces, each retreating about 7 feet. The step nearest the ground is 37.5 feet high, and the top one is 29 feet high. It is built entirely of limestone quarried from the neighbouring hills. The blocks are small and badly cut, and the courses are concave, according to the plan applied both to quays and to fortresses. On examining the breaches in the masonry, it is seen that the outer face of each step is coated with 2 layers, each of which has its regular casing. The mass is solid, the chambers being cut in the rock below the pyramid. It has 4 entrances, the main one being in the north, and the passages form a perfect labyrinth, which is perilous to enter. Porticos with columns, galleries, and chambers all end in a kind of pit, in the bottom of which a hiding place was contrived, doubtless intended to contain the most precious objects of the funeral furniture. The pyramids which surround this extraordinary monument have been nearly all built on one plan, and only differ in their proportions. The door opens close below the first course, about the middle of the north face, and the passage descends by a gentle slope between 2 walls of limestone. It is plugged up all along by large blocks, which needed to be broken up before the first chamber could be entered. Beyond this chamber it is carried for some way through the limestone rock, then it passes between walls, ceiling, and floor of polished syenite, after which the limestone reappears, and the passage opens in the vestibule. The part built of granite is interrupted thrice, at intervals of 2 to 2.5 feet, by 3 enormous portcullises of granite. Above each of these a hollow is left, in which the portcullis stone could be held up by props, and thus leave a free passage. The mummy once placed inside, the workmen, as they left, removed the supports, and the portcullises fell into place, cutting off all communication with the outside. The vestibule was flanked on the east by a flat-roofed serdab, divided into 3 niches, and encumbered with chips of stone swept hastily in by workmen when they cleared the chambers to receive the mummy. The pyramid of Unas has all 3 niches preserved, but in the pyramids of Teti and of Merenra, the separating walls have been neatly cut away in ancient times, without leaving any trace but a line of attachment, and a whiter colour in the stone where it had originally been covered. The sarcophagus chamber extends west of the vestibule. The sarcophagus was placed there along the west wall, feet to the south, head to the north. The roof over the two main chambers was pointed. It was formed of large beams of limestone, joined at the upper ends and supported below upon a low bench, which surrounded the chamber outside. The first beams were covered by two others, and these by two more, and the six altogether thoroughly protected the vestibule of the vault. The pyramids of Gizeh belonged to the pharaohs of the 4th dynasty, and those of Abusir to the pharaohs of the 5th. The 5 pyramids of Saqqara, of which the plan is uniform, belonged to Unas and to the first 4 kings of the 6th dynasty, Teti, Pepi I, Merenra, and Pepi II, and are contemporary with the mastabas with painted vaults which I have mentioned above. It is, therefore, no matter of surprise to find them inscribed and decorated. The ceilings are covered with stars to represent the night sky. The rest of the decoration is very simple. In the pyramid of Unas, which is the most ornamented, the decoration occupies only the end wall of the sepulchral chamber. The part against the sarcophagus was lined with alabaster and engraved to represent great monumental doors, through which the deceased was supposed to enter his storerooms of provisions. The figures of men and of animals, the scenes of daily life, the details of the sacrifice, are not here represented, and moreover would not be in keeping. They belong to those places where the double lived his public life, and where visitors actually performed the rites of offering. The passages in vault in which the soul alone was free to wander needed no ornamentation except that which related to the life of the soul. The texts are of two kinds. One kind, of which there are the fewest, refer to the nourishment of the double, and are literal transcriptions of the formulae by which the priests ensured the transmission of each object to the other world. This was a last resource for him in case the real sacrifices should be discontinued, or the magic scenes upon the chapel walls be destroyed. The greater part of the inscriptions were of a different kind. They referred to the soul, and were intended to preserve it from the dangers which awaited it in heaven and on earth. They revealed to it the sovereign incantations which protected it against the bites of serpents and venomous animals, the passwords which enabled it to enter into the company of the good gods, and the exorcisms which counteracted the influence of the evil gods. The destiny of the double was to continue to lead the shadow of its terrestrial life, and fulfil it in the chapel. The destiny of the soul was to follow the sun across the sky, and it, therefore, needed the instructions which it read upon the walls of the vault. It was by their virtue that the absorption of the dead into Osiris became complete, and that they enjoyed hereafter all the immunity of the divine state. Above, in the chapel, they were men, and acted as men; but here they were gods, and acted as gods. The enormous rectangular mass, which the Arabs call Mastabat el Pharaon, the seat of the pharaoh, stands beside the pyramid of Pepi II. Some have thought it to be an unfinished pyramid, some a tomb surmounted by an obelisk. In reality, it is a pyramid which was left unfinished by its builder, King Ati of the 6th dynasty. Recent excavations here have, on the other hand, shown that the brick pyramids of Dashur probably belonged to the 12th dynasty. The stone pyramids of that group, which may be older, furnish a curious variation from the usual type. One of these stone pyramids has the lower half inclined at 54 degrees 41 minutes, while the upper part changes sharply to 42 degrees 59 minutes. It might be called a mastaba crowned by a gigantic attic. At Lisht, where the two pyramids now standing are of the same period (one of them was erected by Usertesen I), the structure is again changed. The sloping passage ends in a vertical shaft, at the bottom of which open chambers, now filled by the infiltration of the Nile. The pyramids of Illahun and Hawara, which contained the remains of Usertesen and Amenemhat III, are of the same type as those at Lisht. Their rooms are now filled with water. The pyramid at Medum is empty, having been violated before the Ramesside age. It consists of 3 square towers, with sides slightly sloping, placed in retreating stages, one over the other. The entrance is on the north, at about 53 feet above the sand. After 60 feet, the passage goes into the rock. At 174 feet, it runs level. At 40 feet farther, it stops, and turns perpendicularly towards the surface, opening in the floor of a vault 21 feet higher. A set of beams and ropes still in place above the opening show that spoilers drew the sarcophagus out of the chamber in ancient times. Its small chapel, built against the eastern slope of the pyramid, with courtyard containing a low flat altar between two standing stelae nearly 14 feet high, was found intact. The walls of the chamber were uninscribed and bare, but the graffiti found there prove that the place was much visited during the times of the 18th dynasty by scribes, who recorded their admiration of the beauty of the monument, and believed that King Sneferu had raised it for himself and for his queen Merizanku. The custom of building pyramids did not end with the 12th dynasty. There are later pyramids at Manfalut, at Hekali to the south of Abydos, and at Mohammeria to the south of Esneh. Until the Roman period, the semi-barbarous sovereigns of Ethiopia held it as a point of honour to give the pyramid form to their tombs. The oldest, those of Nuri, where the pharaohs of Napata sleep, recall by their style the pyramids of Saqqara. The latest, those of Meroe, present fresh characteristics. They are higher than they are wide, are built of small blocks, and are sometimes decorated at the angles with rounded borderings. The east face has a false window surmounted by a cornice, and is flanked by a chapel, which is preceded by a pylon. These pyramids are not all dumb. As in ordinary tombs, the walls contain scenes borrowed from the ritual of burial, or showing the vicissitudes of the life beyond the grave. End of Chapter 3, Section 2. Recording by Timothy Ferguson, Gold Coast, Australia. Chapter 3, Section 3 of Manual of Egyptian Archaeology and Guide to the Study of Antiquities in Egypt by Gaston Maspero, translated by Amelia B. Edwards. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Timothy Ferguson. Chapter 3, Section 3. The Tombs of the Theban Empire. Excavated Tombs. Two subsequent systems replaced the mastaba throughout Egypt. The first preserved the chapel constructed above ground, and combined the pyramid with the mastaba. The second excavated the whole tomb in the rock, including the chapel. The necropolis quarter of Abydos, in which were interred the earlier generations of the Theban Empire, furnishes the most ancient examples of the first system. The tombs are built of large, black, unbaked bricks, made without any mixture of straw or grit. The lower part is a mastaba with a square or oblong rectangular base, the greatest length of the latter being sometimes 40 or 50 feet. The walls are perpendicular, and are seldom high enough for a man to stand upright inside the tomb. On this kind of pedestal was erected a pointed pyramid of from 12 to 30 feet in height, covered externally with a smooth coat of clay painted white. The defective nature of the rock below forbade the excavation of the sepulchral chamber. There was no resource, therefore, except to hide it in the brickwork. An oven-shaped chamber with corbel vault was constructed in the centre, but more frequently the sepulchral chamber is found to be half above the ground in the mastaba, and half sunk in the foundations, the vaulted space above being left only to relieve the weight. In many cases there was no external chapel, the stela placed in the basement or set in the outer face alone marking the place of offering. In other instances, a square vestibule was constructed in front of the tomb where the relations assembled. Occasionally a breast-high enclosure wall surrounded the monument, and defined the boundaries of the ground belonging to the tomb. This mixed form was much employed in Theban cemeteries from the beginning of the Middle Empire. Many kings and nobles of the 11th dynasty were buried at Drah Abul Neggeh in tombs like those of Abydos. The relative proportion of mastaba and pyramid became modified during the succeeding centuries. The mastaba, often mere insignificant substructure, gradually returned to its original height, while the pyramid as gradually decreased, and ended by being only an unimportant pyramidion. All the monuments of this type, which ornamented the Theban necropolis during the Ramesside period, have perished. But contemporary tomb paintings show many varieties, and the chapels of an Apis which died during the reign of Amenhotep III still remains to show that this fashion extended as far as Memphis. Of the pyramidion, Scarcely any traces remain, but the mastaba is intact. It is a square mass of limestone raised on a base, supported by 4 columns at the corners, and surmounted by an overhanging cornice. A flight of 5 steps leads up to the inner chamber. The earliest examples of the second kind are those found at Gizeh among the mastabas of the 4th dynasty, and these are neither large nor much ornamented. They begin to be carefully wrought about the time of the 6th dynasty, and in certain distant places, as at Bersheh, Sheikh Said, Kasr es Said, Aswan, and Negadeh. The rock-cut tomb did not, however, attain its full development until the times of the last Memphite kings and the early kings of the Theban line. In these rock-cut tombs we find all the various parts of the mastaba. The designer selected a prominent vein of limestone, high enough in the cliffside to risk nothing from the gradual rising of the soil, and yet low enough for the funeral procession to reach it without difficulty. The feudal lords of Minya slept at Beni Hassan, those of Khmunu at Bersheh, those of Siut and Elephantine at Siut, and in the cliff opposite Aswan. Sometimes, as at Siut, Bersheh, and Thebes, the tombs are excavated at various levels. Sometimes, as at Beni Hassan, they follow the line of the stratum, and are ranged in nearly horizontal terraces. A flight of steps, rudely constructed in rough-hewn stones, leads up from the plain to the entrance of the tomb. At Beni Hassan and Thebes, these steps are either destroyed or buried in sand, but recent excavations have brought to light a well-preserved example leading up to a tomb at Aswan. The funeral procession, having slowly scaled the cliffside, halted for a moment at the entrance to the chapel. The plan was not necessarily uniform throughout any one group of tombs. Several of the Beni Hassan tombs have porticos, the pillars, bases, and entablatures being all cut in the rock. Those of Ameni and Khnumhotep have porticos supported on 2 polygonal columns. At Aswan, the doorway forms a high and narrow recess cut in the rock wall, but is divided at about 1/3 of its height by a rectangular lintel, thus making a smaller doorway in the doorway itself. At Siut, the tomb of Hatizepha was entered by a true porch about 24 feet in height, with a vaulted roof elegantly sculptured and painted. More frequently, the side of the mountain was merely cut away, and the stone dressed over a more or less extent of surface, according to the intended dimensions of the tomb. This method ensured the twofold advantage of clearing a little platform closed in on 3 sides in front of the tomb, and also of forming an upright façade which could be decorated or left plain according to the taste of the proprietor. The door sunk in the middle of this façade has sometimes no framework; sometimes, however, it has 2 jambs and a lintel, all slightly projecting. The inscriptions, when any occur, are very simple, consisting of 1 or 2 horizontal lines above, and 1 or 2 vertical lines down each side, with the addition perhaps of a sitting or standing figure. These inscriptions contain a prayer, as well as the name, titles, and parentage of the deceased. The chapel generally consists of a single chamber, either square or oblong, with a flat or slightly vaulted ceiling. Light is admitted only through the doorway. Sometimes a few pillars, left standing in the rock at the time of excavation, give this chamber the aspect of a little hypostyle hall. 4 such pillars decorate the chapels of Ameni and Khnumhotep at Beni Hassan. Other chapels there contain 6 or 8, and are very irregular in plan. One tomb, unfinished, was in the first instance a simple oblong hall, with a barrel roof and 6 columns. Later on it was enlarged on the right side, the new part forming a kind of flat-roofed portico supported on 4 columns. To form a serdab in the solid rock was almost impossible, while, on the other hand, movable statues, if left in a room accessible to all comers, would be exposed to theft or mutilation. The serdab, therefore, was transformed and combined with the stela of the ancient mastabas. The false door of the olden time became a niche cut in the end wall, almost always facing the entrance. Statues of the deceased and his wife, carved in the solid rock, were there enthroned. The walls were decorated with scenes of offerings, and the entire decoration of the tomb converged towards the niche, as that of the mastaba converged towards the stela. The series of tableaux is, on the whole, much the same as of old, though with certain noteworthy additions. The funeral procession and the scene where the deceased enters into possession of his tomb, both merely indicated in the mastaba, are displayed in full upon the walls of the Theban sepulchre. The mournful cortege is there, with the hired mourners, the troop of friends, the bearers of offerings, the boat for crossing the river, and the catafalque drawn by oxen. It arrives at the door of the tomb, the mummy placed upright upon his feet, receives the farewell of the family, and the last ceremonies, which are to initiate him into the life beyond the grave, are duly represented. The sacrifices, with all the preliminary processes, as tillage, seed growing, harvesting, stock breeding, and the practice of various kinds of handicrafts, are either sculptured or painted as before. Many details, however, which are absent from the tombs of earlier dynasties, are here given, while others which are invariably met with in the neighbourhood of the pyramids are lacking. 20 centuries work many changes in the usages of daily life, even in conservative Egypt. We look in vain for herds of gazelles upon the walls of the Theban tombs, for the reason that these animals in Ramesside times had ceased to be bred in a state of domestication. The horse, on the other hand, had been imported into the valley of the Nile, and is depicted pawing the ground where formerly the gazelle was seen cropping the pasturage. The trades are also more numerous and complicated. The workmen's tools are more elaborate. The actions of the deceased are more varied and personal. In former times, when first the rules of tomb decoration were formulated, the notion of future retribution either did not exist or was but dimly conceived. The deeds which he had done here on earth in no wise influenced the fate which awaited the man after death. Whether good or bad, from the moment when the funeral rites were performed and necessary prayers recited, he was rich and happy. In order to establish his identity, it was enough to record his name, his title, and his parentage. His past was taken for granted. But when once a belief in rewards and punishments to come had taken possession of men's minds, they bethought them of the advisability of giving each dead man the benefit of his individual merits. To the official register of his social status, they now therefore added a brief biographical notice. At first this consisted of only a few words, but towards the time of the Sixth Dynasty, as where Una recounts his public services under 4 kings, these few words developed into pages of contemporary history. With the beginning of the new empire, tableaux and inscriptions combined to immortalise the deeds of the owner of the tomb. Khnumhotep of Beni Hassan records in full the origin and greatness of his ancestors. Kheti displays upon his walls all the incidents of a military life, parades, war dances, sieges, and sanguinary battle scenes. In this respect, as in all others, the 18th dynasty perpetuated the tradition of preceding ages. In his fine tomb at Tel al Amarna, recounts the episode of his marriage with the daughter of Khuenaten. Neferhotep of Thebes, having received from Horemheb the decoration of the golden collar, complacently reproduces every little incident of his investiture, the words spoken by the king, as also the year and the day when this crowning reward was conferred upon him. Another, having conducted a survey, is seen attended by his subordinates with their measuring chains. Elsewhere he superintends a census of the population, just as T formerly superintended the numbering of his cattle. The stela partakes of these new characteristics in wall decoration. In addition to the usual prayers, it now proclaims the praises of the deceased, and gives a summary of his life. This is too seldom followed by a list of his honours, with their dates. When space permitted, the vault was excavated immediately below the chapel. The shaft was sometimes sunk in a corner of one of the chambers, and sometimes outside, in front of the door of the tomb. In the great cemeteries, as for instance at Thebes and Memphis, the superposition of these 3 parts, the chapel, the shaft, and the vault, was not always possible. If the shaft were carried to its accustomed depth, there was sometimes the risk of breaking into tombs excavated at a lower level. This danger was met either by driving a long passage into the rock, and then sinking the shaft at the farther end, or by substituting a slightly sloping or horizontal disposition of the parts for the old vertical arrangement of the mastaba model. The passage in this case opens from the centre of the end wall, its average length being from 20 to 130 feet. The sepulchral vault is always small and plain, as well as the passage. Under the Theban dynasties, as under the Memphite kings, the soul dispensed with decorations. But whenever the walls of the vault are decorated, the figures and inscriptions are found to relate chiefly to the life of the soul, and very slightly to the life of the double. In the tomb of Horhotep, which is of the time of the Usirtessens, and in similar rock-cut sepulchres, the walls, except on the side of the door, are divided into two registers. The upper row belongs to the double, and contains, beside the table of offerings, pictured representations of the same objects which are seen in certain mastabas of the Sixth Dynasty, namely stuffs, jewels, arms, and perfumes, all needful to Horhotep for the purpose of imparting eternal youth to his limbs. The lower register belonged to both the soul and the double, and is inscribed with extracts from a variety of liturgical writings, such as the Book of the Dead, the Ritual of Embalmment, and the Funeral Ritual, all of which were possessed of magic properties which protected the soul and supported the double. The stone sarcophagus and even the coffin are also covered with closely written inscriptions. Precisely as the stela epitomised the whole chapel, so did the sarcophagus and coffin epitomise the sepulchral chamber, thus forming, as it were, a vault within a vault. Texts, tableaux, all thereon depicted, treat of the life of the soul, and of its salvation in the world to come. At Thebes, as at Memphis, the royal tombs are those which it is most necessary to study, in order to estimate the high degree of perfection to which the decoration of passages and sepulchral chambers was now carried. The most ancient were situated either in the plain or on the southern slopes of the western mountain, and of these no remains are extant. The mummies of Amenhotep I and Thothmes III, of Sekenenra and Ar-hotep, have survived the dwellings of solid stone designed for their protection. Towards the middle of the 18th dynasty, however, all the best places were taken up, and some unoccupied site in which to establish a new royal cemetery had to be sought. At first they went a considerable distance, namely to the end of the valley, known as the Western Valley, which opens from near Drah Abul Neggeh. Amenhotep III, I, and perhaps others, were there buried. Somewhat later they preferred to draw nearer to the city of the living. Behind the cliff which forms the northern boundary of the plain of Thebes, there lay a kind of rocky hollow closed in on every side, and accessible from the outer world by only a few perilous paths. It divides into two branches, which cross almost at right angles. One branch turns to the south-east, while the other, which again divides into secondary branches, turns to the south-west. Westward rises a mountain which recalls upon a gigantic scale the outline of the great step pyramid at Saqqara. The Egyptian engineers of the time observed that this hollow was separated from the ravine of Amenhotep III by a mere barrier some 500 cubits in thickness. In this there was nothing to dismay such practised miners. They therefore cut a trench some 50 or 60 cubits deep through the solid rock, at the end of which a narrow passage opens like a gateway into the hidden valley beyond. Was it in the time of Horemheb, or during the reign of Rameses I, that this gigantic work was accomplished? Rameses I is, at all events, the earliest king whose tomb has as yet been found in this spot. His son Seti I, then his grandson Rameses II, came hither to rest beside him. The Ramesside pharaohs followed one after the other. Herhor may perhaps have been the last of the series. These crowded catacombs caused the place to be called the Valley of the Tombs of the Kings, a name which it retains to this day. These tombs are not complete. Each had its chapel, but those chapels stood far away in the plain, at Gurneh, at the Ramesseum, at Medinet Habu, and they have already been described. The Theban rock, like the Memphite pyramid, contained only the passages and the sepulchral chamber. During the daytime the pure soul was in no serious danger, but in the evening, when the eternal waters which flow along the vaulted heavens fall in vast cascades down the west and are engulfed in the bowels of the earth, the soul follows the bark of the sun and its escort of luminary gods into a lower world, bristling with ambuscades and perils. For 12 hours the divine squadron defiles through long and gloomy corridors, where numerous genii, some hostile, some friendly, now struggle to bar the way, and now aid it in surmounting the difficulties of the journey. Great doors, each guarded by a gigantic serpent, were stationed at intervals, and led to an immense hall full of flame and fire, peopled by hideous monsters, and executioners whose office it was to torture the damned. Then came more dark and narrow passages, more blind gropings in the gloom, more strife with malevolent genii, and again the joyful welcoming of the propitious gods. At midnight began the upward journey towards the eastern regions of the world, and in the morning, having reached the confines of the land of darkness, the sun emerged from the east to light another day. The tombs of the kings were constructed upon the model of the world of night. They had their passages, their doors, their vaulted halls, which plunged down into the depths of the mountain. Their positions in the valley were determined by no consideration of dynasty or succession. Each king attacked the rock at any point where he might hope to find a suitable bed of stone, and this was done with so little regard for his predecessors that the workmen were sometimes obliged to change the direction of the excavation in order not to invade a neighbouring catacomb. The designer's plan was a mere sketch, to be modified when necessary, and which was by no means intended to be strictly carried out. Hence the plan and measurements of the actual tomb of Rameses IV. Differ in the outline of the sides and in the general arrangement from the plan of the same tomb which is preserved on a papyrus in the Turin Museum. Nothing, however, could be more simple than the ordinary distribution of the parts. A square door, very sparingly ornamented, opened upon a passage leading to a chamber of more or less extent. From the further end of this chamber opened a second passage, leading to a second chamber, and thence sometimes to more chambers, the last of which contained the sarcophagus. In some tombs the whole excavation is carried down a gently inclined plane, broken perhaps by only one or two low steps between the entrance and the end. In others the various parts follow each other at lower and lower levels. In the catacomb of Seti I, a long and narrow flight of stairs and a sloping corridor lead to a little antechamber and two halls, supported by pillars. A second staircase leads through a second antechamber to another pillared hall, which was the hiding place of the sarcophagus. The tomb did not end here. A third staircase opening from the end of the principal hall was in progress, and would no doubt have led to more halls and chambers had not the work been stopped by the death of the king. If we go from catacomb to catacomb, we do not find many variations from this plan. The entrance passage in the tomb of Rameses III. Is flanked by 8 small lateral chambers. In almost every other instance, the lesser or greater length of the passages and the degree of finish given to the wall paintings constitute the only differences between one tomb and another. The smallest of these catacombs comes to an end at 53 feet from the entrance. That of Seti I, which is the longest, descends to a distance of 470 feet, and there remains unfinished. The same devices to which the pyramid builders had recourse in order to mislead the spoiler were adopted by the engineers of the Theban catacombs. False shafts were sunk, which led to nothing, and walls, sculptured and painted, were built across the passages. When the burial was over, the entrance was filled up with blocks of rock, and the natural slope of the mountainside was restored as skilfully as might be. The most complete type of this class of catacomb is that left to us by Seti I. Figures and hieroglyphs alike are models of pure design and elegant execution. The tomb of Rameses III. Already points to decadence. It is for the most part roughly painted. Yellow is freely laid on, and the raw tones of reds and blues are suggestive of early daubs of our childhood. Mediocrity ere long reigns supreme, the outlines becoming more feeble, the colour more and more glaring, till the latest tombs are but caricatures of those of Seti I and Rameses III. The decoration is always the same, and is based on the same principles as the decoration of the pyramids. At Thebes, as at Memphis, the intention was to secure to the double the free enjoyment of his new abode, and to usher the soul into the company of the gods of the solar cycle and the Assyrian cycle, as well as to guide it through the labyrinth of the infernal regions. But the Theban priests exercised their ingenuity to bring before the eyes of the deceased all that which the Memphites consigned to his memory by means of writing, thus enabling him to see what he had formerly been obliged to read upon the walls of his tomb. When the texts of the Pyramid of Unas relate how Unas, being identified with the sun, navigates the celestial waters or enters the fields of Aalu, the pictured walls of the tomb of Seti I show Seti sailing in the solar bark, while a side chamber of the tomb of Rameses III shows Rameses III in the fields of Aalu. Where the walls of the pyramid of Unas give the prayers recited over the mummy to open his mouth, to restore the use of his limbs, to clothe, to perfume, to feed him, the walls of Seti's catacomb contain representations of the actual mummy, of cast statues which are the supports of his double, and of the priests who open their mouths, who clothe them, perfume them, and offer them the various meats and drinks of the funeral feast. The ceilings of the pyramid chambers were sprinkled over with stars to resemble the face of the heavens, but there was nothing to instruct the soul as to the names of those heavenly bodies. On the ceilings of some of the Theban catacombs we not only find the constellations depicted, each with its personified image, but astronomical tables giving the aspect of the heavens fortnight by fortnight through the months of the Egyptian year, so that the soul had but to lift its eyes and see in what part of the firmament its course lay night after night. Taken as a series, these tableaux form an illustrated narrative of the travels of the sun and the soul throughout the 24 hours of the day and night. Each hour is represented, as also the domain of each hour with its circumscribed boundary, the door of which is guarded by a huge serpent. These serpents have their various names, as Fire Face, Flaming Eye, Evil Eye, etc. The fate of souls was decided in the third hour of the day. They were weighed by the god Thoth, who consigned them to their future abode according to the verdict of the scales. The sinful soul was handed over to the cynocephalous ape assessors of the infernal tribunal, who hunted and scourged it, after first changing it into a sow or some other impure animal. The righteous soul, on the contrary, passed into the fifth hour, into the company of his fellows, whose task it was to cultivate the fields of Aalu, and reap the corn of the celestial harvest, after which they took their pleasure under the guardianship of the good genii. After the fifth hour, the heavenly ocean became a vast battlefield. The gods of light pursued, captured, and bound the serpent Apapi, and at the 12th hour they strangled him. But this triumph was not of long duration. Scarcely had the sun achieved this victory when his bark was borne by the tide into the realm of the night hours, and from that moment he was assailed, like Virgil and Dante at the gates of hell, by frightful sounds and clamourings. Each circle had its voice, not to be confounded with the voices of other circles. Here the sound was an immense humming of wasps; yonder it was the lamentations of women for their husbands, and the howling of she-beasts for their mates. Elsewhere it was as the rolling of the thunder. The sarcophagus, as well as the walls, was covered with these scenes of joyous or sinister import. It was generally of red or black granite. As it was put in hand last of all, it frequently happened that the sculptors had not time to finish it. When finished, however, the scenes and texts with which it was covered contained an epitome of the whole catacomb. Thus, lying in his sarcophagus, the dead man found his future destinies depicted thereon, and learned to understand the blessedness of the gods. The tombs of private persons were not so often elaborately decorated. Two tombs of the pyramid of the 26th dynasty, that of Petamenoph at Thebes, and that of Barkenref at Memphis, compete in this respect, however, with the royal catacombs. Their walls are not only sculptured with the text, more or less complete, of the Book of the Dead, but also with long extracts from the Book of the Opening of the Mouth, and the religious formulae found in the pyramids. As every part of the tomb had its special decoration, so it also had its special furniture. Of the chapel furniture, few traces have been preserved. The table of offerings, which was of stone, is generally all that remains. The objects placed in the serdab, in the passages, and in the sepulchral chamber have suffered less from the ravages of time and the hand of man. During the ancient empire, the funerary portrait statues were always immured in the serdab. The sepulchral vault contained, besides the sarcophagus, headrests of limestone or alabaster, geese carved in stone, sometimes, though rarely, a scribe's palette, generally some terracotta vases of various shapes, and lastly a store of food cereals, and the bones of the victims sacrificed on the day of the burial. Under the Theban dynasties, the household goods of the dead were richer and more numerous. The cast statues of his servants and family, which in former times were placed in the serdab with those of the master, were now consigned to the vault, and made on a smaller scale. On the other hand, many objects which used to be merely depicted on the walls, were now represented by models, or by actual specimens. Thus we find miniature funeral boats with crew, mummy, mourners, and friends complete; imitation bread offerings of baked clay, erroneously called funerary cones, stamped with the name of the deceased; bunches of grapes in glazed ware; and limestone moulds wherewith the deceased was supposed to make pottery models of oxen, birds, and fish, which should answer the purpose of fish, flesh, and fowl. Toilet and kitchen utensils, arms, and instruments of music abound. These are mostly broken, piously slain in order that their souls should go hence to wait upon the soul of the dead man in the next world. Little statuettes of stone, wood, and enamel, blue, green, and white, are placed by hundreds and even by thousands with these piles of furniture, arms, and provisions. Properly speaking, they are reduced serdab statues, destined, like their larger predecessors, to serve as bodies for the double, and, by a later conception, for the soul. They were at first represented clothed like the individual whose name they bore. As time went on, their importance dwindled, and their duties were limited to merely answering for their master when called by Thoth to the corvée, and acting as his substitutes when he was summoned by the gods to work in the fields of Aalu. Thereafter they were called respondents, Ushabtiu, and were represented with agricultural implements in their hands. No longer clothed as the man was clothed when living, they were made in the semblance of a mummified corpse, with only the face and hands unbandaged. The so-called canopic vases, with lids fashioned like heads of hawks, cynocephali, jackals, and men, were reserved from the time of the 11th dynasty for the viscera, which were extracted from the body by the embalmers. As for the mummy, it continued, as time went on, to be more and more enwrapped in cartonnage, and more liberally provided with papyri and amulets, each amulet forming an essential part of its magic armour, and serving to protect its limbs and soul from destruction. Theoretically, every Egyptian was entitled to an eternal dwelling, constructed after the plan which I have here described, with its successive modifications. But the poorer folk were fain to do without those things which were the necessities of the wealthier dead. They were buried wherever it was cheapest, in old tombs which had been ransacked and abandoned, in the natural clefts of the rock, or in common pits. At Thebes, in the time of the Ramessides, great trenches dug in the sand awaited their remains. The funeral rites once performed, the grave diggers cast a thin covering sand over the day's mummies, sometimes in lots of 2 or 3, and sometimes in piles, which they did not even take the trouble to lay in regular layers. Some were protected only by their bandages, others were wrapped about with palm branches, lashed in the fashion of a game basket. Those most cared for lie in boxes of rough-hewn wood, neither painted nor inscribed. Many are huddled into old coffins, which have not even been altered to suit the size of the new occupant, or into a composite contrivance made of the fragments of 3 or 4 broken mummy cases. As to funerary furniture, it was out of the question for such poor souls as these. A pair of sandals of painted cardboard or plated reeds, a staff for walking along the heavenly highways, a ring of enamelled ware, a bracelet or necklace of little blue beads, an image of Ptah or Osiris or Anubis, of Hathor or of Bast, a few mystic eyes or scarabs, and, above all, a twist or two of cord around the arm, the neck, the leg, or the body, intended to preserve the corpse from magical influences, are the only possessions of the pauper dead. End of Chapter 3, Part 3. Recording by Timothy Ferguson, Gold Coast, Australia.